The Girl Who Owned a Bear by L. Frank Baum. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Mama had gone downtown to shop. She had asked Nora to look after Jane Gladys, and Nora promised she would. But it was her afternoon for polishing the silver, so she stayed in the pantry and left Jane Gladys to amuse herself alone in the big sitting room upstairs. The little girl did not mind being alone, for she was working on her first piece of embroidery, a sofa pillow for Papa's birthday present. So she crept into the big bay window and curled herself up on the broad sill while she bent her brown head over her work. Soon the door opened and closed again, quietly. Jane Gladys thought it was Nora, so she didn't look up until she had taken a couple more stitches on a forget-me-not. Then she raised her eyes and was astonished to find a strange man in the middle of the room who regarded her earnestly. He was short and fat and seemed to be breathing heavily from his climb up the stairs. He held a work silk hat in one hand, and underneath his other elbow was tucked a good-sized book. He was dressed in a black suit that looked old and rather shabby, and his head was bald upon the top. "Excuse me," he said, while the child gazed at him in solemn surprise. "Are you Jane Gladys Brown?" "Yes, sir," she answered. Very good indeed," he remarked with a queer sort of smile. "I've had quite a hunt to find you, but I've succeeded at last." "How did you get in?" inquired Jane Gladys, with a growing distrust of her visitor. "That is a secret," he said mysteriously. This was enough to put the girl on her guard. She looked at the man, and the man looked at her, and both looks were grave and somewhat anxious. "What do you want?" she asked, straightening herself up with a dignified air. "Ah, now we are coming to business," said the man briskly. "I'm going to be quite frank with you. To begin with, your father has abused me in a most ungentlemanly manner." Jane Gladys got off the windowsill and pointed her small finger at the door. "Leave this room immediately," she cried, her voice trembling with indignation. "My papa is the best man in the world. He never abused anybody." "Allow me to explain, please," said the visitor, without paying any attention to her request to go away. "Your father may be very kind to you, for you are his little girl, you know. But when he's downtown in his office, he's inclined to be rather severe, especially on book agents. Now, I called on him the other day and asked him to buy the complete works of Peter Smith, and what do you suppose he did?" She said nothing. "Why," continued the man with a growing excitement, "he ordered me from his office and had me put out of the building by the janitor. What do you think of such treatment as that from the best papa in the world, eh?" "I think he was quite right," said Jane Gladys. "Oh, you do? Well," said the man, "I resolved to be revenged for the insult. So as your father is big and strong and a dangerous man, I have decided to be revenged upon his little girl." Jane Gladys shivered. "What are you going to do?" she asked. "I'm going to present you with this book," he answered, taking it from under his arm. Then he sat down on the edge of a chair, placed his hat on the rug, and drew a fountain pen from his vest pocket. "I'll write your name in it," said he. "How do you spell Gladys?" "Gladys," she replied. "Thank you. Now this," he continued, rising and handing her the book with a bow, "is my revenge for your father's treatment of me. Perhaps he'll be sorry he didn't buy the complete works of Peter Smith. Goodbye, my dear." He walked to the door, gave her another bow, and left the room, and Jane Gladys could see that he was laughing to himself as if very much amused. When the door had closed behind the queer little man, the child sat down in the window again and glanced at the book. It had a red and yellow cover, and the word "Thingamajigs" was across the front in big letters. Then she opened it curiously and saw her name written in black letters upon the first white leaf. He was a funny little man, she said to herself thoughtfully. She turned the next leaf and saw a big picture of a clown, dressed in green and red and yellow and having a very white face with three-cornered spots of red on each cheek and over the eyes. While she looked at this, the book trembled in her hands. The leaf crackled and creaked, and suddenly the clown jumped out of it and stood upon the floor beside her, becoming instantly as big as any ordinary clown. After stretching his arms and legs and yawning in a rather impolite manner, he gave a silly chuckle and said, "This is better. You don't know how cramped one gets standing so long upon a page of flat paper." Perhaps you can imagine how startled Jane Gladys was and how she stared at the clown who had just leaped out of the book. "You didn't expect anything of this sort, did you?" he asked, leering at her in clown fashion. Then he turned around to take a look at the room, and Jane Gladys laughed in spite of her astonishment. "What amuses you?" demanded the clown. "Why, the back of you is all white," cried the girl. "You're only a clown in front of you." "Quite likely," he returned in an annoyed tone, "the artist made a front view of me. He wasn't expected to make the back of me, for that was against the page of the book." "But it makes you look so funny," said Jane Gladys, laughing until her eyes were moist with tears. The clown looked sulky and sat down upon a chair so she couldn't see his back. "I'm not the only thing in the book," he remarked crossly. This reminded her to turn another page, and she had scarcely noted that it contained the picture of a monkey, when the animal sprang from the book with a great crumpling of paper and landed upon the window seat beside her. "Hee hee 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 hee," chattered the creature, springing to the girl's shoulder and then to the center table. "This is great fun. Now I can be a real monkey instead of a picture of one." "Real monkeys can't talk," said Jane Gladys reprovingly. "How do you know? Have you ever been one yourself?" inquired the animal. And then he laughed loudly, and the clown laughed too, as if he enjoyed the remark. The girl was quite bewildered by this time. She thoughtlessly turned another leaf, and before she had time to look twice, a great donkey leaped from the book and stumbled from the window seat to the floor with a great clatter. "You're clumsy enough, I'm sure," said the child indignantly, for the beast had nearly upset her. "Clumsy? And why not?" demanded the donkey with angry voice. "If the fool artist had drawn you out of perspective as he did me, I guess you'd be clumsy yourself." "What's wrong with you?" asked Jane Gladys. "My front and rear legs on the left side are nearly 6 inches too short. That's what's the matter. If that artist didn't know how to draw properly, why did he try to make a donkey at all?" "I don't know," replied the child, seeing an answer was expected. "I can hardly stand up," grumbled the donkey, "and the least little thing will topple me over." "Don't mind that," said the monkey, making a spring at the chandelier and swinging from it by his tail until Jane Gladys feared he would knock all the globes off. "The same artist has made my ears as big as that clown's, and everyone knows a monkey hasn't any ears to speak of, much less to draw. He should be prosecuted," remarked the clown gloomily. "I haven't any back." Jane Gladys looked from one to the other with a puzzled expression upon her sweet face and turned another page of the book. Swift as a flash there sprang over her shoulder a tawny spotted leopard, which landed upon the back of a big leather armchair and turned upon the others with a fierce movement. The monkey climbed to the top of the chandelier and chattered with fright. The donkey tried to run and straightway tipped over on his left side. The clown grew paler than ever, but he sat still in his chair and gave a low whistle of surprise. The leopard crouched upon the back of the chair, lashed his tail from side to side, and glared at all of them by turns, including Jane Gladys. "Which of us are you going to attack first?" asked the donkey, trying hard to get upon his feet again. "I can't attack any of you," snarled the leopard. "The artist made my mouth shut, so I haven't any teeth, and he forgot to make my claws." But I'm a frightful-looking creature nevertheless, am I not? Oh, yes, said the clown, indifferently. I suppose you frightful-looking enough, but if you have no teeth nor claws, we don't mind your looks at all. This so annoyed the leopard that he growled horribly, and the monkey laughed at him. Just then the book slipped from the girl's lap, and as she made a movement to catch it, one of the pages near the back opened wide. She caught a glimpse of a fierce grizzly bear looking at her from the page and quickly threw the book from her. It fell with a crash in the middle of the room, but beside it stood the great grizzly, who had wrenched himself from the page before the book closed. Now, cried the leopard from his perch, you'd better look out for yourselves. You can't laugh at him as you did at me. The bear has both claws and teeth. "'Deed I have," said the bear in a low, deep, growling voice. "And I know how to use them, too. If you read in that book, you'll find I'm described as a horrible, cruel, and remorseless grizzly, whose only business in life is to eat up little girls, shoes, dresses, ribbons, and all. And then the author says I smack my lips and glory in my wickedness." "That's awful," said the donkey, sitting upon his haunches and shaking his head sadly. "What do you suppose possessed the author to make you so hungry for girls? Do you eat animals also?" "The author did not mention my eating anything but little girls," replied the bear. "Very good," remarked the clown, drawing a long breath of relief. "You may begin eating Jane Gladys as soon as you wish. She laughed because I had no back." "And she laughed because my legs are out of perspective," brayed the donkey. "But you also deserve to be eaten," screamed the leopard from the back of the leather chair, "for you laughed and poked fun at me because I had no claws nor teeth. Don't you suppose, Mr. Grizzly, you could manage to eat a clown, a donkey, and a monkey after you finish the girl?" "Perhaps so, and a leopard into the bargain," growled the bear. "It will depend on how hungry I am, but I must begin on the little girl first because the author says I prefer girls to anything." Jane Gladys was much frightened on hearing this conversation, and she began to realize what the man meant when he said he gave her the book to be revenged. Surely Papa would be sorry he hadn't bought the complete works of Peter Smith when he came home and found his little girl eaten up by a grizzly bear, shoes, dress, ribbons, and all. The bear stood up and balanced himself on his rear legs. "This is the way I look in the book," he said. "Now watch me eat the little girl." He advanced slowly toward Jane Gladys, and the monkey, the leopard, the donkey, and the clown all stood around in a circle and watched the bear with much interest. But before the grizzly reached her, the child had a sudden thought and cried out, "Stop! You mustn't eat me. It would be wrong." "Why?" asked the bear in surprise. "Because I own you. You're my private property," she answered. "I don't see how you make that out," said the bear in a disappointed tone. "Why, the book was given to me. My name's on the front leaf, and you belong by rights in the book, so you mustn't dare to eat your owner." The grizzly hesitated. "Can any of you read?" he asked. "I can," said the clown. "Then see if she speaks the truth. Is her name really in the book?" The clown picked it up and looked at the name. "It is," said he, "Jane Gladys Brown, and written quite plainly in big letters." The bear sighed. "Then of course I can't eat her," he decided. "That author is as disappointing as most authors are." "He's not as bad as the artist," exclaimed the donkey, who was still trying to stand up straight. "The fault lies with yourselves," said Jane Gladys severely. "Why didn't you stay in the book where you were put?" The animals looked at each other in a foolish way, and the clown blushed under his white paint. "Really?" began the bear, and then he stopped short. The doorbell rang loudly. "It's Mama!" cried Jane Gladys, springing to her feet. "She's come home at last. Now, you stupid creatures!" But she was interrupted by them all making a rush for the book. There was a swish and a whir, and a rustling of leaves, and an instant later the book lay upon the floor, looking just like any other book, while Jane Gladys's strange companions had all disappeared. This story should teach us to think quickly and clearly upon all occasions, for had Jane Gladys not remembered that she owned the bear, he probably would have eaten her before the bell rang. End of The Girl Who Owned a Bear by L. Frank Baum. Read by Jacqueline Burrell Walton.
How Peep-Peep Saw the World by Carolyn Sherwin Bailey. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Once upon a time, there was a small yellow chicken named Peep-Peep, and as soon as he clipped his shell and came out on his 2 yellow legs, he discovered that he had a great wish. He did not want to stay at home on the farm. No, he would not stay at home on the farm. Peep-Peep wanted to go out in the world and find his fortune. So he crept under the garden gate, and he started up a road, a small yellow chicken, all by himself. "A field of corn just for me," said Peep-Peep as he made his way along through the dust that was almost up to his feathers. "I will go on until I find a field of corn that I can own." So this little chicken went on until he came to a wide field full of standing ears of corn. There it was, right before his eyes. But, oh dear, the corn stood too high for him. Peep-Peep was nearly lost in the jungle of the cornfield, and he was not able to reach a single kernel. So he had to start along the road again. "The largest chicken run in the world for my home," said Peep-Peep next as he went on again through the dust. "I will go on until I find that chicken run." So this little chicken went on until he came to a great chicken run beside the road. There were houses for all kinds of hens, red hens, white hens, and speckled hens. There were hundreds of chickens running about and doing as they wished. Peep-Peep went into the chicken run and he mingled with the other fowls. He heard an old rooster talking in a wise way to the older chickens. "Cock-a-doodle-doo, 62 of you," crowed the rooster, and the chickens seemed alarmed. "What is he saying?" asked Peep-Peep. 62 of us young chickens will be taken to market tomorrow," a young Rhode Island Red told him. "Dear me, what a narrow escape I have had," said Peep-Peep to himself as he hurried out of the large chicken run and took his way again along the road. But he was not through wishing. "A mother with fine feathers," he said to himself, although he was too hungry and tired to peep very loudly. "I will go on until I have found a hen with the finest feathers in the world." As the little chicken went on, his peeping was heard, and suddenly the very mother for whom he had been wishing appeared beside the road. She had a family with her, but she made room among them for Peep-Peep. She had bright, beautiful feathers that shone in the sun. She even wore orange boots. Peep-Peep followed his new mother, although now he was scarcely able to walk. "She will lead us to corn and water," he thought. And just when it seemed as if the little chicken could not take another step, the fowl with fine feathers led them all to water. It was a deep and wide pond. In she went, and all her family followed, leaving Peep-Peep frightened on the bank. He had taken an old duck for a mother. There seemed nothing then for Peep-Peep to do but to find his way home again. It was a long, hard way through the deep dust, but he accomplished the journey. He came back to his farm toward the end of the day and crept back under the gate. The children were out scattering corn. As Peep-Peep watched them and ate, it seemed to him that he had found a field of corn for himself. How comfortable the chicken coop looked, and his mother's feathers shone in the setting sun with a pleasant color. They were thick enough, Peep-Peep knew, to cover a whole family of chickens. He had seen the world, but he had found that everything he had looked for was to be found right there at home. End of How Peep-Peep Saw the World by Carolyn Sherwin Bailey. Read by Colleen McMahon.
The Tale of Mr. Jeremy Fisher by Beatrix Potter. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Once upon a time there was a frog called Mr. Jeremy Fisher. He lived in a little damp house amongst the buttercups at the edge of a pond. The water was all slippy sloppy in the larder and in the back passage, but Mr. Jeremy liked getting his feet wet. Nobody ever scolded him, and he never caught a cold. He was quite pleased when he looked out and saw large drops of rain splashing in the pond. "I will get some worms and go fishing and catch a dish of minnows for my dinner," said Mr. Jeremy Fisher. "If I catch more than 5 fish, I will invite my friends Mr. Alderman Ptolemy Tortoise and Sir Isaac Newton. The alderman, however, eats salad." Mr. Jeremy put on a mackintosh and a pair of shiny goloshes. He took his rod and basket and set off with enormous hops to the place where he kept his boat. The boat was round and green and very like the other lily leaves. It was tied to a water plant in the middle of the pond. Mr. Jeremy took a reed pole and pushed the boat out into open water. "I know a good place for minnows," said Mr. Jeremy Fisher. Mr. Jeremy stuck his pole into the mud and fastened the boat to it. Then he settled himself cross-legged and arranged his fishing tackle. He had the dearest little red float. His rod was a tough stalk of grass, his line was a fine long white horsehair, and he tied a little wriggling worm at the end. The rain trickled down his back, and for nearly an hour he stared at the float. "This is getting tiresome. I think I should like some lunch," said Mr. Jeremy Fisher. He punted back again amongst the water plants, and took some lunch out of his basket. "I will eat a butterfly sandwich, and wait till the shower is over," said Mr. Jeremy Fisher. A great big water beetle came up underneath the lily leaf and tweaked the toe of one of his goloshes. Mr. Jeremy crossed his legs up shorter out of reach and went on eating his sandwich. Once or twice something moved about with a rustle and a splash amongst the rushes at the side of the pond. "I trust that is not a rat," said Mr. Jeremy Fisher. "I think I had better get away from here." Mr. Jeremy shoved the boat out again a little way and dropped in the bait. There was a bite almost directly. The float gave a tremendous bobbit. "A minnow! A minnow! I have him by the nose!" cried Mr. Jeremy Fisher, jerking up his rod. But what a horrible surprise! Instead of a smooth, fat minnow, Mr. Jeremy landed little Jack Sharp, the stickleback covered with spines. The stickleback floundered about the boat, pricking and snapping until he was quite out of breath. Then he jumped back into the water, and a shoal of other little fishes put their heads out and laughed at Mr. Jeremy Fisher. And while Mr. Jeremy sat disconsolately on the edge of his boat, sucking his sore fingers and peering down into the water, a much worse thing happened. A really frightful thing it would have been if Mr. Jeremy had not been wearing a mackintosh. A great big enormous trout came up, ker-plop, with a splash, and it seized Mr. Jeremy with a snap. "Ow, ow, ow!" And then it turned and dived down to the bottom of the pond. But the trout was so displeased with the taste of the mackintosh that in less than half a minute it spat him out again, and the only thing it swallowed was Mr. Jeremy's goloshes. Mr. Jeremy bounced up to the surface of the water like a cork in the bubbles out of a soda water bottle, and he swam with all his might to the edge of the pond. He scrambled out on the first bank he came to, and he hopped home across the meadows with his mackintosh all in tatters. "What a mercy that was not a pike," said Mr. Jeremy Fisher. "I have lost my rod and basket, but it does not much matter, for I am sure I should never have dared to go fishing again." He put some sticking plasters on his fingers, and his friends both came to dinner. He could not offer them fish, but he had something else in his larder. Sir Isaac Newton wore his black and gold waistcoat, and Mr. Alderman Ptolemy Tortoise brought a salad with him in a string bag. And instead of a nice dish of minnows, they had a roasted grasshopper with ladybird sauce, which frogs consider a beautiful treat, but I think it must have been nasty. The end. End of The Tale of Mr. Jeremy Fisher by Beatrix Potter.
The Little Match Girl of Andersen's Fairy Tales. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Andersen's Fairy Tales by Hans Christian Andersen. The Little Match Girl. Most terribly cold it was. It snowed, and was nearly quite dark, and evening, the last evening of the year. In this cold and darkness there went along the street a poor little girl, bareheaded, and with naked feet. When she left home, she had slippers on, it is true, but what was the good of that? They were very large slippers, which her mother had hitherto worn. So large were they, the poor little thing lost them as she scuffled away across the street, because of two carriages that rolled by dreadfully fast. One slipper was nowhere to be found. The other had been laid hold of by an urchin, and off he ran with it. He thought it would do capitally for a cradle when he some day or other should have children himself. So the little maiden walked on with her tiny naked feet. They were quite red and blue from cold. She carried a quantity of matches in an old apron, and she held a bundle of them in her hand. Nobody had bought anything of her the whole livelong day. No one had given her a single farthing. She crept along trembling and cold with hunger, a very picture of sorrow, the poor little thing. The flakes of snow covered her long fair hair, which fell in beautiful curls around her neck. But of that, of course, she never once now thought. From all the windows the candles were gleaming, and it smelt so deliciously of roast goose, for you know it was New Year's Eve. Yes, of that she thought. In a corner formed by two houses, of which one advanced more than the other, she seated herself down and cowered together. Her little feet she had drawn close up, but she grew colder and colder, and to go home she did not venture, for she had not sold any matches and could not bring a farthing of money. From her father she would certainly get blows, and at home it was cold too, for above her she had only the roof, through which the wind whistled, even though the largest cracks were stopped up with straw and rags. Her little hands were almost numbed with cold. Oh, a match might afford her a world of comfort, if she only dared take a single one out of the bundle, draw it against the wall, and warm her fingers by it. She drew one out. Rich! How it blazed! How it burnt! It was a warm, bright flame, like a candle, as she held her hands over it. It was a wonderful light. It seemed really to the little maiden as though she was sitting before a large iron stove, with burnished brass feet and a brass ornament atop. The fire burned with such blessed influence. It warmed so delightfully. The little girl had already stretched out her feet to warm them too. But the small flame went out. The stove vanished, and she had only the remains of the burnt-out match in her hand. She rubbed another against the wall. It burned brightly, and where the light fell on the wall, there the wall became transparent like a veil, so that she could see into the room. On the table was spread a snow-white tablecloth. Upon it was a splendid porcelain service, and the roast goose was steaming famously with its stuffing of apple and dried plums. And what was still more capital to behold was, the goose hopped down from the dish, reeled about on the floor with knife and fork in its breast, till it came up to the poor little girl, when the match went out, and nothing but the thick, cold, damp wall was left behind. She lighted another match. Now there she was sitting under the most magnificent Christmas tree. It was still larger and more decorated than the one which she had seen through the glass door in the rich merchant's house. Thousands of lights were burning on the green branches, and gaily colored pictures, such as she had seen in the shop windows, looked down upon her. The little maiden stretched out her hands to warm them when the match went out. The lights of the Christmas tree rose higher and higher. She saw them now as stars in heaven. One fell down and formed a long trail of fire. "Someone is just dead," said the little girl, for her old grandmother, the only person who had loved her, and who was now no more, had told her that when a star falls, a soul ascends to God. She drew another match against the wall. It was again light, and in the lustre there stood the old grandmother, so bright and radiant, so mild, and with such an expression of love. "Grandmother," cried the little one, "oh, take me with you. You go away when the match burns out. You vanish like the warm stove, like the delicious roast goose, and like the magnificent Christmas tree." And she rubbed the whole bundle of matches quickly against the wall, for she wanted to be quite sure of keeping her grandmother near her. And the matches gave such a brilliant light that it was brighter than at noonday. Never formerly had the grandmother been so beautiful and so tall. She took the little maiden on her arm, and both flew in brightness and in joy so high, so very high, and then above was neither cold, nor hunger, nor anxiety. They were with God. But in the corner, at the cold hour of dawn, sat the poor girl, with rosy cheeks and with a smiling mouth, leaning against the wall, frozen to death on the last evening of the old year. Stiff and stark sat the child, there with her matches, of which one bundle had been burnt. She wanted to warm herself, people said. No one had the slightest suspicion of what beautiful things she had seen. No one even dreamed of the splendor in which with her grandmother she had entered on the joys of a new year. End of The Little Match Girl.
Little Thumbelina by Hans Christian Andersen. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. There was once a woman who wished very much to have a little child. She went to a fairy and said, "I should so very much like to have a little child. Can you tell me where I can find one?" "Oh, that can be easily managed," said the fairy. "Here is a barleycorn. It is not exactly of the same sort as those which grow in the farmer's fields, and which the chickens eat. Put it into a flower pot, and see what will happen." "Thank you," said the woman, and she gave the fairy 12 shillings, which was the price of the barleycorn. Then she went home and planted it, and there grew a large, handsome flower, somewhat like a tulip in appearance, but with its leaves tightly closed as if it were still a bud. "It is a beautiful flower," said the woman, and she kissed the red and golden-colored petals. And as she did so, the flower opened, and she could see that it was a real tulip. Upon the green velvet stamens sat a very delicate and graceful little maiden. She was scarcely half as long as a thumb, and they gave her the name of Little Thumb, or Thumbelina, because she was so small. A walnut shell, elegantly polished, served her for a cradle. Her bed was formed of blue-violet leaves, with a rose-leaf for a counterpane. Here she slept at night, but during the day she amused herself on a table, where the peasant wife had placed a plate full of water. Round this plate were wreaths of flowers, with their stems in the water, and upon it floated a large tulip leaf, which served the little one for a boat. Here she sat and rowed herself from side to side, with 2 oars made of white horsehair. It was a very pretty sight. Thumbelina could also sing so softly and sweetly that nothing like her singing had ever before been heard. One night, while she lay in her pretty bed, a large, ugly, wet toad crept through a broken pane of glass in the window and leaped right upon the table where she lay sleeping under her rose-leaf quilt. "What a pretty little wife this would make for my son," said the toad, and she took up the walnut shell in which Thumbelina lay asleep, and jumped through the window with it, into the garden. In the swampy margin of a broad stream in the garden lived the toad with her son. He was uglier even than his mother, and when he saw the pretty little maiden in her elegant bed, he could only cry, "Croak, croak, croak." "Don't speak so loud, or she will wake," said the toad, "and then she might run away, for she is light as swan's down. We will place her on one of the water-lily leaves out in the stream. It will be like an island to her, she is so light and small, and then she cannot escape. And while she is away, we will make haste and prepare the stateroom under the marsh, in which you are to live when you are married." Far out in the stream grew a number of water lilies, with broad green leaves, which seemed to float on top of the water. The largest of these leaves appeared farther off than the rest, and the old toad swam out to it with the walnut shell, in which Thumbelina still lay asleep. The tiny creature woke very early in the morning, and began to cry bitterly when she found where she was, for she could see nothing but water on every side of the large green leaf, and no way of reaching the land. Meanwhile, the old toad was very busy under the marsh, decking her room with rushes and yellow wildflowers to make it look pretty for her new daughter-in-law. Then she swam out with her ugly son to the leaf on which she had placed poor Thumbelina. She wanted to bring the pretty bed, that she might put it in the bridal chamber to be ready for her. The old toad bowed low to her in the water and said, "Here is my son. He will be your husband, and you will live happily together in the marsh by the stream." "Croak, croak," was all her son could say for himself. So the toad took up the elegant little bed and swam away with it, leaving Thumbelina all alone on the green leaf, where she sat and wept. She could not bear to think of living with the old toad, and having her ugly son for a husband. The little fishes, who swam about in the water beneath, had seen the toad and heard what she said, so they lifted their heads above the water to look at the little maiden. As soon as they caught sight of her, they saw she was very pretty, and it vexed them to think that she must go and live with the ugly toads. No, it must never be! So they gathered together in the water, round the green stalk which held the leaf on which the little maiden stood, and gnawed it away at the root with their teeth. Then the leaf floated down the stream, carrying Thumbelina far away out of reach of land. Thumbelina sailed past many towns, and the little birds in the bushes saw her and sang, "What a lovely little creature!" So the leaf swam away with her farther and farther, till it brought her to other lands. A graceful little white butterfly constantly fluttered round her, and at last alighted on the leaf. The little maiden pleased him, and she was glad of it, for now the toad could not possibly reach her, and the country through which she sailed was beautiful, and the sun shone upon the water till it glittered like liquid gold. She took off her girdle and tied one end of it round the butterfly, fastening the other end of the ribbon to the leaf, which now glided on much faster than before, taking Thumbelina with it as she stood. Presently, a large cockchafer flew by. The moment he caught sight of her, he seized her round her delicate waist with his claws and flew with her into a tree. The green leaf floated away on the brook, and the butterfly flew with it, for he was fastened to it and could not get away. Oh, how frightened Thumbelina felt when the cockchafer flew with her to the tree! But especially was she sorry for the beautiful white butterfly which she had fastened to the leaf, for if he could not free himself, he would die of hunger. But the cockchafer did not trouble himself at all about the matter. He seated himself by her side, on a large green leaf, gave her some honey from the flowers to eat, and told her she was very pretty, though not in the least like a cockchafer. After a time, all the cockchafers who lived in the tree came to pay Thumbelina a visit. They stared at her, and then the young lady cockchafers turned up their feelers and said, "She has only 2 legs. How ugly that looks!" "She has no feelers," said another. "Her waist is quite slim. Pooh! She is like a human being." "Oh, she is ugly," said all the lady cockchafers. The cockchafer who had run away with her believed all the others when they said she was ugly. He would have nothing more to say to her, and told her she might go where she liked. Then he flew down with her from the tree and placed her on a daisy, and she wept at the thought that she was so ugly that even the cockchafers would have nothing to say to her. And all the while, she was really the loveliest creature that one could imagine, and as tender and delicate as a beautiful rose-leaf. During the whole summer, poor little Thumbelina lived quite alone in the wide forest. She wove herself a bed with blades of grass, and hung it up under a broad leaf to protect herself from the rain. She sucked the honey from flowers for food, and drank the dew from their leaves every morning. So passed away the summer and the autumn, and then came the winter. The long, cold winter. All the birds who had sung to her so sweetly had flown away, and the trees and the flowers had withered. The large shamrock under the shelter of which she had lived was now rolled together and shriveled up. Nothing remained but a yellow, withered stalk. She felt dreadfully cold, for her clothes were torn, and she was herself so frail and delicate that she was nearly frozen to death. It began to snow, too, and the snowflakes, as they fell upon her, were like a whole shovelful falling upon one of us, for we are tall, but she was only an inch high. She wrapped herself in a dry leaf, but it cracked in the middle and could not keep her warm, and she shivered with cold. Near the wood in which she had been living was a large cornfield, but the corn had been cut a long time. Nothing remained but the bare, dry stubble standing up out of the frozen ground. It was to her like struggling through a large wood. Oh, how she shivered with the cold! She came at last to the door of a field mouse, who had a little den under the corn stubble. There dwelt the field mouse in warmth and comfort, with a whole roomful of corn, a kitchen, and a beautiful dining room. Poor Thumbelina stood before the door, just like a little beggar girl, and asked for a small piece of barleycorn, for she had been without a morsel to eat for 2 days. "You poor little creature," said the field mouse, for she was a really good old mouse. "Come into my warm room and dine with me." She was pleased with Thumbelina, so she said, "You are quite welcome to stay with me all the winter if you like. But you must keep my rooms clean and neat, and tell me stories, for I shall like to hear them very much." "We shall have a visitor soon," said the field mouse one day. "My neighbor pays me a visit once a week. He is better off than I am. He has large rooms and wears a beautiful black velvet coat. If only you could have him for a husband, you would be well provided for indeed. But he is blind, so you must tell him some of your prettiest stories." Thumbelina did not feel at all interested about this neighbor, for he was a mole. However, he came and paid his visit, dressed in his black velvet coat. "He is very rich and learned, and his house is 20 times larger than mine," said the field mouse. He was rich and learned, no doubt, but he always spoke slightingly of the sun and the pretty flowers because he had never seen them. Thumbelina was obliged to sing to him, "Lady bird, fly away home," and many other pretty songs, and the mole fell in love with her because she had so sweet a voice. But he said nothing yet, for he was very prudent and cautious. A short time before, the mole had dug a long passage under the earth, which led from the dwelling of the field mouse to his own, and here she had permission to walk with Thumbelina whenever she liked. But he warned them not to be alarmed at the sight of a dead bird which lay in the passage. It was a perfect bird, with a beak and feathers, and could not have been dead long. It was lying just where the mole had made his passage. The mole took in his mouth a piece of phosphorescent wood, which glittered like fire in the dark. Then he went before them to light them through the long, dark passage. When they came to the spot where the dead bird lay, the mole pushed his broad nose through the ceiling, so that the earth gave way and the daylight shone into the passage. In the middle of the floor lay a swallow, his beautiful wings pulled close to his sides, his feet and head drawn up under his feathers. The poor bird had evidently died of the cold. It made little Thumbelina very sad to see it. She did so love the little birds. All the summer they had sung and twittered for her so beautifully. But the mole pushed it aside with his crooked legs and said, "He will sing no more now. How miserable it must be to be born a little bird! I am thankful that none of my children will ever be birds. for they can do nothing but cry, tweet, tweet, and must always die of hunger in the winter." "Yes, you may well say that as a clever man," exclaimed the field mouse. "What is the use of his twittering if, when winter comes, he must either starve or be frozen to death? Still, birds are very high-bred." Thumbelina said nothing, but when the two others had turned their backs upon the bird, she stooped down and stroked aside the soft feathers which covered his head, and kissed the closed eyelids. "Perhaps this was the one who sang to me so sweetly in the summer," she said. "And how much pleasure it gave me, you dear, pretty bird." The mole now stopped up the hole through which the daylight shone, and then accompanied the ladies home. But during the night Thumbelina could not sleep, so she got out of bed and wove a large, beautiful carpet of hay. She carried it to the dead bird and spread it over him, with some down from the flowers which she had found in the field mouse's room. It was as soft as wool, and she spread some of it on each side of the bird, so that he might lie warmly in the cold earth. "Farewell, pretty little bird," said she. "Farewell. Thank you for your delightful singing during the summer, when all the trees were green and the warm sun shone upon us." Then she laid her head on the bird's breast, but she was alarmed, for it seemed as if something inside the bird went thump, thump. It was the bird's heart. He was not really dead, only benumbed with the cold, and the warmth had restored him to life. In autumn, all the swallows fly away into warm countries, but if one happens to linger, the cold seizes it, and it becomes chilled and falls down as if dead. It remains where it fell, and the cold snow covers it. Thumbelina trembled very much. She was quite frightened, for the bird was large, a great deal larger than herself. She was only an inch high. But she took courage, laid the wool more thickly over the poor swallow, and then took a leaf which she had used for her own counterpane, and laid it over his head. The next night she again stole out to see him. He was alive, but very weak. He could only open his eyes for a moment to look at Thumbelina, who stood by, holding a piece of decayed wood in her hand, for she had no other lantern. "Thank you, pretty little maiden," said the sick swallow. "I have been so nicely warmed that I shall soon regain my strength and be able to fly about again in the warm sunshine." "Oh," said she, "it is cold out of doors now. It snows and freezes. Stay in your warm bed. I will take care of you." She brought the swallow some water in a flower leaf, and after he had drunk, he told her that he had wounded one of his wings in a thorn bush and could not fly as fast as the others, who were soon far away on their journey to warm countries. At last he had fallen to the earth, and could remember nothing more, nor how he came to be where she had found him. All winter the swallow remained underground, and Thumbelina nursed him with care and love. She did not tell either the mole or the field mouse anything about it, for they did not like swallows. Very soon the springtime came, and the sun warmed the earth. Then the swallow bade farewell to Thumbelina, and she opened the hole in the ceiling which the mole had made. The sun shone in upon them so beautifully that the swallow asked her if she would go with him. She could sit on his back, he said, and he would fly away with her into the green woods. But she knew it would grieve the field mouse if she left her in that manner, so she said, "No, I cannot." "Farewell, then. Farewell, you good, pretty little maiden," said the swallow, and he flew out into the sunshine. Thumbelina looked after him, and the tears rose in her eyes. She was very fond of the poor swallow. "Tweet, tweet," sang the bird, as he flew into the green woods, and Thumbelina felt very sad. She was not allowed to go into the warm sunshine. The corn which had been sowed in the field over the house of the field mouse had grown up high into the air and formed a thick wood to Thumbelina, who was only an inch in height. "You are going to be married, little one," said the field mouse. "My neighbor has asked for you. What good fortune for a poor child like you! Now we will prepare your wedding clothes. They must be woolen and linen. Nothing must be wanting when you are the wife of a mole." Thumbelina had to turn the spindle, and the field mouse hired 4 spiders who were to weave day and night. Every evening the mole visited her, and was continually speaking of the time when the summer would be over. Then he would keep his wedding day with Thumbelina. But now the heat of the sun was so great that it burned the earth and made it hard like stone. As soon as the summer was over, the wedding should take place. But Thumbelina was not at all pleased, for she did not like the tiresome mole. Every morning when the sun rose, and every evening when it went down, she would creep out at the door, and as the wind blew aside the ears of corn so that she could see the blue sky, she thought how beautiful and bright it seemed out there, and wished so much to see her dear friend the swallow again. But he never returned, for by this time he had flown far away into the lovely green forest. When autumn arrived, Thumbelina had her outfit quite ready, and the field mouse said to her, "In 4 weeks the wedding must take place." Then she wept, and said she would not marry the disagreeable mole. "Nonsense," replied the field mouse. "Now don't be obstinate, or I shall bite you with my white teeth. He is a very handsome mole. The queen herself does not wear more beautiful velvets and furs. His kitchens and cellars are quite full. You ought to be very thankful for such good fortune." So the wedding day was fixed, on which the mole was to take her away to live with him, deep under the earth, and never again to see the warm sun because he did not like it. The poor child was very unhappy at the thought of saying farewell to the beautiful sun, and as the field mouse had given her permission to stand at the door, she went to look at it once more. "Farewell, bright sun," she cried, stretching out her arm towards it, and then she walked a short distance from the house, for the corn had been cut, and only the dry stubble remained in the fields. "Farewell, farewell," she repeated, twining her arm around a little red flower that grew just by her side. "Greet the little swallow from me, if you should see him again." "Tweet, tweet," sounded over her head suddenly. She looked up, and there was the swallow himself flying close by. As soon as he spied Thumbelina, he was delighted. She told him how unwilling she was to marry the ugly mole, and to live always beneath the earth, never more to see the bright sun. And as she told him, she wept. "Cold winter is coming," said the swallow, "and I am going to fly away into warmer countries. Will you go with me? You can sit on my back and fasten yourself on with your sash. Then we can fly away from the ugly mole and his gloomy rooms, far away, over the mountains into warmer countries, where the sun shines more brightly than here, where it is always summer, and the flowers bloom in greater beauty. Fly now with me, dear little one. You saved my life when I lay frozen in that dark, dreary passage." "Yes, I will go with you," said Thumbelina, and she seated herself on the bird's back, with her feet on his outstretched wings, and tied her girdle to one of his strongest feathers. The swallow rose in the air and flew over forest and over sea, high above the highest mountains, covered with eternal snow. Thumbelina would have been frozen in the cold air, but she crept under the bird's warm feathers, keeping her little head uncovered so that she might admire the beautiful lands over which they passed. At length they reached the warm countries, where the sun shines brightly and the sky seemed so much higher above the earth. Here on the hedges and by the wayside grew purple, green, and white grapes. Lemons and oranges hung from trees in the fields, and the air was fragrant with myrtles and orange blossoms. Beautiful children rang along the country lanes, playing with large gay butterflies. And as the swallow flew further and further, every place appeared still more lovely. At last they came to a blue lake, and by the side of it, shaded by trees of the deepest green, stood a palace of dazzling white marble, built in the olden times. Vines clustered round its lofty pillars, and at the top were many swallows' nests, and one of these was the home of the swallow who carried Thumbelina. "This is my house," said the swallow, "but it would not do for you to live there. You would not be comfortable. You must choose for yourself one of these lovely flowers, and I will put you down upon it, and then you shall have everything that you can wish to make you happy." "That will be delightful," she said, and clapped her little hands for joy. A large marble pillar lay on the ground, which in falling had been broken into 3 pieces. Between these pieces grew the most beautiful large white flowers, so the swallow flew down with Thumbelina and placed her on one of the broad leaves. But how surprised she was to see in the middle of the flower a tiny little man, as white and transparent as if he had been made of crystal. He had a gold crown on his head, and delicate wings at his shoulders, and was not much larger than she was herself. He was the angel of the flower, for a tiny man and a tiny woman dwell in every flower, and this was the king of them all. "Oh, how beautiful he is!" whispered Thumbelina to the swallow. The little prince was at first quite frightened at the bird, who was like a giant compared to such a delicate little creature as himself. But when he saw Thumbelina, he was delighted, and thought her the prettiest little maiden he had ever seen. He took the gold crown from his head and placed it on hers, and asked her name, and if she would like to be his wife and queen over all the flowers. This certainly was a very different sort of husband from the son of the toad, or the mole with his black and velvet fur. So she said yes to the handsome prince. Then all the flowers opened, and out of each came a little lady or a tiny lord, all so pretty it was quite a pleasure to look at them. Each of them brought Thumbelina a present, but the best gift was a pair of beautiful wings, which had belonged to a large white fly, and they fastened them to Thumbelina's shoulders so that she might fly from flower to flower. Then there was much rejoicing, and the little swallow, who sat above them in his nest, was asked to sing a wedding song, which he did as well as he could. But in his heart he felt sad, for he was very fond of Thumbelina, and would have liked never to part from her again. "You must not be called Thumbelina any more," said the spirit of the flowers to her. "It is an ugly name, and you are so very lovely. We will call you Maya." "Farewell, farewell," said the swallow, with a heavy heart as he left the warm countries to fly back into Denmark. There he had a nest over the window of a house in which dwelt the writer of fairy tales. The swallow sang, "Tweet, tweet," and from his song came the whole story. End of Little Thumbelina by Hans Christian Andersen.
Raggedy Ann Learns a Lesson by Johnny Gruelle. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. One day the dolls were left all to themselves. Their little mistress had placed them all around the room and told them to be nice children while she was away. And there they sat and never even so much as wiggled a finger until their mistress had left the room. Then the soldier dolly turned his head and solemnly winked at Raggedy Ann. And when the front gate clicked and the dollies knew they were alone in the house, they all scrambled to their feet. "Now let's have a good time," cried the tin soldier. "Let's all go in search of something to eat." "Yes, let's all go in search of something to eat," cried all the other dollies.
"When Mistress had me out playing with her this morning," said Raggedy Ann, "she carried me by a door near the back of the house, and I smelled something which smelled as if it would taste delicious."
"Then you lead the way, Raggedy Ann," cried the French dolly. "I think it would be a good plan to elect Raggedy Ann as our leader on this expedition," said the Indian doll. At this, all the other dolls clapped their hands together and shouted, "Hurrah! Raggedy Ann will be our leader." So Raggedy Ann, very proud indeed to have the confidence and love of all the other dollies, said that she would be very glad to be their leader.
"Follow me!"
she cried as her wobbly legs carried her across the floor at a lively pace. The other dollies followed, racing about the house until they came to the pantry door.
"This is the place!"
cried Raggedy Ann, and sure enough, all the dollies smelled something which they knew must be very good to eat. But none of the dollies was tall enough to open the door. Although they pushed and pulled with all their might, the door remained tightly closed. The dollies were talking and pulling and pushing, and every once in a while one would fall over and the others would step on her in their efforts to open the door. Finally, Raggedy Ann drew away from the others and sat down on the floor. When the other dollies discovered Raggedy Ann sitting there, running her rag hands through her yarn hair, they knew she was thinking. "Shh! Shh!" they said to each other, and quietly went over near Raggedy Ann and sat down in front of her.
"There must be a way to get inside,"
said Raggedy Ann. "Raggedy says there must be a way to get inside," cried all the dolls.
"I can't seem to think clearly today," said Raggedy Ann. "It feels as if my head were ripped."
At this, the French doll ran to Raggedy Ann and shook off her bonnet. "Yes, there is a rip in your head, Raggedy," she said, and pulled a pin from her skirt and pinned up Raggedy's head. "It's not a very neat job, for I got some puckers in it," she said.
"Oh, that is ever so much better," cried Raggedy Ann. "Now I can think quite clearly."
"Now Raggedy can think quite clearly," cried all the dolls.
"My thoughts must have leaked out the rip before," said Raggedy Ann.
"They must have leaked out before, dear Raggedy," cried all the other dolls.
"Now that I can think so clearly," said Raggedy Ann, "I think the door must be locked, and to get in we must unlock it."
"That will be easy," said the Dutch doll, who says "Mama" when he is tipped backward and forward, "for we will have the brave tin soldier shoot the key out of the lock." "I can easily do that," cried the tin soldier as he raised his gun.
"Oh, Raggedy Ann," cried the French dolly, "please do not let him shoot." "No," said Raggedy Ann, "we must think of a quieter way."
After thinking quite hard for a moment, Raggedy Ann jumped up and said, "I have it!" And she caught up the jumping jack and held him up to the door. Then Jack slid up his stick and unlocked the door. Then the dollies all pushed and the door swung open. My, such a scramble! The dolls piled over one another in their desire to be the first at the goodies. They swarmed upon the pantry shelves and in their eagerness spilled a pitcher of cream which ran all over the French dolly's dress. The Indian doll found some cornbread and dipping it in the molasses, he sat down for a good feast. A jar of raspberry jam was overturned and the dollies ate of this until their faces were all purple. The tin soldier fell from the shelf 3 times and bent one of his tin legs, but he scrambled right back up again. Never had the dolls had so much fun and excitement, and they all had eaten their fill when they heard the click of the front gate. They did not take time to climb from the shelves, but all rolled or jumped off to the floor and scrambled back to their room as fast as they could run, leaving a trail of breadcrumbs and jam along the way. Just as their mistress came into the room, the dolls dropped in whatever positions they happened to be in. "This is funny," cried Mistress. "They were all left sitting in their places around the room. I wonder if Fido has been shaking them up." Then she saw Raggedy Ann's face and picked her up. "Why, Raggedy Ann, you are all sticky." I do believe you are covered with jam." And Mistress tasted Raggedy Ann's hand. "Yes, it's jam! Shame on you, Raggedy Ann. You've been in the pantry, and all the others too." And with this, the doll's mistress dropped Raggedy Ann on the floor and left the room. When she came back, she had on an apron and her sleeves were rolled up. She picked up all the sticky dolls and, putting them in a basket, she carried them out under the apple tree in the garden. There she had placed her little tub and wringer, and she took the dolls one at a time and scrubbed them with a scrubbing brush and soused them up and down and this way and that in the soap suds until they were clean. Then she hung them all out on the clothesline in the sunshine to dry. There the dolls hung all day, swinging and twisting about as the breeze swayed the clothesline.
"I do believe she scrubbed my face so hard she wore off my smile,"
said Raggedy Ann after an hour of silence. "No, it's still there," said the tin soldier, as the wind twisted him around so he could see Raggedy. "But I do believe my arms will never work without squeaking, they feel so rusted," he added. Just then the wind twisted the little Dutch doll and loosened his clothespin, so that he fell to the grass below with a sawdusty bump. As he rolled over, he said, "Ma," in a squeaky voice. Late in the afternoon, the back door opened, and the little mistress came out with a table and chairs. After setting the table, she took all the dolls from the clothesline and placed them about the table. They had lemonade with grape jelly in it, which made it a beautiful lavender color, and little baby teeny-weeny cookies with powdered sugar on them. After this lovely dinner, the dollies were taken into the house, where they had their hair brushed and nice clean nighties put on. Then they were placed in their beds, and Mistress kissed each one goodnight and tiptoed from the room. All the dolls lay as still as mice for a few minutes. Then Raggedy Ann raised up on her cotton-stuffed elbows and said,
"I have been thinking."
"Shh!" said all the other dollies. "Raggedy has been thinking."
"Yes,"
said Raggedy Ann.
"I have been thinking. Our mistress gave us the nice dinner out under the trees to teach us a lesson. She wished us to know that we could have all the goodies we wished whenever we wished if we had behaved ourselves. And our lesson was that we must never take without asking what we could always have for the asking. So let us all remember and try never again to do anything which might cause those who love us any unhappiness."
"Let us all remember," chimed all the other dollies, and Raggedy Ann, with a merry twinkle in her shoe-button eyes, lay back in her little bed, her cotton head filled with thoughts of love and happiness. End of Raggedy Ann Learns a Lesson by Johnny Gruelle, read by Heather Eney. Recipe for a Happy Day by Johnny Gruelle. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. One morning, Margery's mama called to her several times before Margery answered, for her pretty brown eyes were very sleepy and would hardly stay open. "Come, dear! Please hurry, for I want you to run to the grocery before breakfast," Mama called from the foot of the stairs. "Oh, dear!" exclaimed Margery. "I don't want to get up." And keeping her head on the pillow just as long as she could, Margery crawled out of bed backwards. Her clothes were scattered about the room and her stockings were turned inside out. Her dress would not fasten, and she cried so that Mama had to come upstairs and dress her. So you see, Margery's day began all wrong, for everything started topsy-turvy. "Now hurry, dear," Mama said as she handed Margery the basket. Margery slammed the door as she went out, and she was so cross she did not notice the beautiful sunshine, nor hear the pretty songs which greeted her from the treetops. "It's so far to the old store," Margery grumbled to herself, as she pouted her pretty lips and shuffled her feet along the path.
"Hello, Margery,"
laughed a merry voice. Margery saw a queer little elf sitting upon a stone at the side of the road. His little green suit was so near the color of the leaves, Margery could scarcely distinguish him from the foliage. He wore a funny little pointed cap of a brilliant red, and sticking in it was a long yellow feather. 2 long hairs grew from his eyebrows and curled over his cap. He was hardly as large as Margery's doll Jane. "Who are you, and where did you come from?" Margery cried, for she thought him the most comical little creature she had ever seen.
"Why, I'm Mary Chuckle from Make-Believe Land," replied the elf. "And aren't you very cross this lovely day?"
"I did not want to get up," cried Margery, "and I just hate to go to the store. It's too far." She dropped her basket on the ground and sat down beside the elf on the large stone.
"Isn't it funny?"
laughed Mary Chuckle.
"There are hundreds of children just like you who make hard work of getting up when they are called in the morning and who remain cross and ugly all day."
"I really do not mean to be cross, but I just can't help it sometimes," Margery said.
"Oh, but indeed you can help it, Margery,"
the elf solemnly said as he shook his tiny finger at her nose.
"And I'm going to tell you how. First of all, when you wake in the morning, you must say to yourself, 'Oh, what a lovely, happy day this is going to be.' Then raise your arms above your head and take 3 long, deep breaths. Jump out of bed quickly, and always remember to put your toes on the floor first. For," continued Mary Chuckle, "old Witchy Crosspath is always waiting for children to get out of bed backwards, and when they do, she catches them by the heels and turns everything topsy-turvy all day. But when you get out of bed toes first, I'll be there to start you on a pleasant day, and Witchy Crosspath will have to return to Make-Believe Land and hide her head."
"Sure enough, I did crawl out of bed backwards this morning," Margery said.
"I know you did, my dear," Mary Chuckle giggled. "And every time you do, old Witchy Crosspath makes everything seem disagreeable."
"But I hate to run errands, Mr. Chuckle," cried Margery. "The old road is so dreadfully long and tiresome."
"But the longer the road, the more happiness you can find along the way, my dear,"
Mary Chuckle replied, quick as a wink, his little eyes twinkling brightly.
"If you look up at the blue sky and the beautiful sunshine and sing with the birds as you run along, you'll find the road seems too short, and you'll be back before you notice it. Just try it and see."
So Margery looked up the road, and with a smile, sure enough, it did not seem so far to the store. And when she turned around, she was sitting upon the stone, alone. The little elf had suddenly disappeared. Margery picked up her basket and skipped down the road, singing at the top of her voice, and before she had time to think about how far it was, she was back at home telling Mama about the queer little elf from Make-Believe Land. "You haven't been away long enough to stop and talk with anyone on the road," laughed Mama. "Are you sure you have not been dreaming?" Margery wondered if it really only had been a dream. But the next morning, when the golden sunshine peeped through her bedroom curtains, Margery did as Mary Chuckle had told her the day before. First of all, she woke up and cried, "Oh, what a lovely day this is going to be!" Then she took 3 long, deep breaths, and she jumped out of bed quickly, right on her toes. And sure enough, old Witchy Crosspath had to go back to Make-Believe Land and hide her head. So Margery spent a lovely, happy day with Mary Chuckle.
"I hope all children will hear of my recipe for a joyous day," said Mary Chuckle, "so that each day for them can be filled with sunshine and happiness."
End of Recipe for a Happy Day by Johnny Gruelle. Read by Heather Eney.
The Story of the 3 Little Pigs by Unknown. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Once upon a time there was an old sow with 3 little pigs, and as she had not enough to keep them, she sent them out to seek their fortune. The first that went off met a man with a bundle of straw, and said to him, "Please, man, give me that straw to build me a house," which the man did, and the little pig built a house with it. Presently came along a wolf, and knocked at the door and said, little pig, let me come in." To which the pig answered, "No, no, by the hair of my chinny chin chin." "Then I'll huff and I'll puff and I'll blow your house in," said the wolf. So he huffed and he puffed and he blew his house in and ate up the little pig. The second pig met a man with a bundle of furs and said, "Please, man, give me that furs to build a house," which the man did, and the pig built his house. Then along came the wolf and said, little pig, let me come in. No, no, by the hair of my chinny chin chin. Then I'll puff and I'll huff and I'll blow your house in. So he huffed and he puffed and he puffed and he huffed, and at last he blew the house down and ate up the second little pig. The third little pig met a man with a load of bricks and said, please, man, give me those bricks to build a house with. So the man gave him the bricks and he built his house with them. So the wolf came, as he did to the other little pigs, and said, little pig, let me come in. No, no, by the hair of my chinny chin chin. Then I'll huff and I'll puff and I'll blow your house in. Well, he huffed and he puffed and he huffed and he puffed and he puffed and he huffed, but he could not get the house down. When he found that he could not, with all his huffing and puffing, blow the house down, he said, little pig, I know where there is a nice field of turnips. Where? Said the little pig. Oh, in Mr. Smith's home field, and if you will be ready tomorrow morning, I will call for you, and we will go together and get some for dinner. Very well, said the little pig. I will be ready. What time do you mean to go? Oh, at 6 o'clock. Well, the little pig got up at 5 and got the turnips and was home again before 6. When the wolf came, he said, little pig, are you ready? Ready, said the little pig. I have been and come back again and got a nice pot full for dinner. The wolf felt very angry at this, but thought that he would be up to the little pig somehow or other. So he said, little pig, I know where there is a nice apple tree. Where? Said the pig. Down at Mary Garden, replied the wolf, and if you will not deceive me, I will come for you at 5 o'clock tomorrow, and we will go together and get some apples. Well, the little pig woke at 4 the next morning and bustled up and went off for the apples, hoping to get back before the wolf came, but he had farther to go and had to climb the tree, so that just as he was coming down from it, he saw the wolf coming, which, as you may suppose, frightened him very much. When the wolf came up, he said, little pig, what? Are you here before me? Are they nice apples? Yes, very, said the little pig. I will throw you down one. And he threw it so far that while the wolf was gone to pick it up, the little pig jumped down and ran home. The next day the wolf came again and said to the little pig, there is a fair in the town this afternoon. Will you go? Oh, yes, said the pig, I will go. What time shall you be ready? At 3, said the wolf. So the little pig went off before the time as usual and got to the fair and bought a butter churn and was on his way home with it when he saw the wolf coming. Then he could not tell what to do, so he got into the churn to hide, and in doing so turned it around and he began to roll and roll down the hill with the pig inside it, which frightened the wolf so much that he ran home without going to the fair. He went to the little pig's house and told him how frightened he had been by a great round thing which came down the hill past him. Then the little pig said, "Ha! I frightened you, did I? I had been to the fair and bought a butter churn, and when I saw you I got into it and rolled down the hill." Then the wolf was very angry indeed, and declared he would eat up the little pig, and that he would get down the chimney after him. When the little pig saw what he was about, he hung on the pot full of water and made up a blazing fire, and just as the wolf was coming down, took off the cover of the pot, and in fell the wolf. And the little pig put on the cover again in an instant, boiled him up and ate him for supper, and lived happy ever after. End of The Story of the Three Little Pigs by Unknown.
The Tailor of Gloucester by Beatrix Potter. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. In the time of swords and periwigs and full-skirted coats with flowered lappets, when gentlemen wore ruffles and gold-laced waistcoats of paduasoy and taffeta, there lived a tailor in Gloucester. He sat in the window of a little shop in Westgate Street, cross-legged on a table, from morning till dark. All day long while the light lasted, he sewed and snippeted, piecing out his satin and pompadour and lutestring. Stuffs had strange names, and were very expensive in the days of the Tailor of Gloucester. But although he sewed fine silk for his neighbours, He himself was very, very poor, a little old man in spectacles, with a pinched face, old crooked fingers, and a suit of threadbare clothes. He cut his coats without waste, according to his embroidered cloth. They were very small ends and snippets that lay about on the table. "Two narrow breadths for naught, except waistcoats for mice," said the tailor. One bitter cold day near Christmas time, the tailor began to make a coat of cherry-colored corded silk embroidered with pansies and roses, and a cream-colored satin waistcoat trimmed with gauze and green worsted chenille for the mayor of Gloucester. The tailor worked, and he talked to himself. He measured the silk and turned it round and round, and trimmed it into shape with his shears. The table was all littered with cherry-colored snippets. "No breadth at all, and cut on the cross. It is no breadth at all. Tippets for mice and ribbons for mobs. For mice," said the tailor of Gloucester. When the snowflakes came down upon the small leaded window panes and shut out the light, the tailor had done his day's work. All the silk and satin lay cut out upon the table. There were 12 pieces for the coat and 4 pieces for the waistcoat, and there were pocket flaps and cuffs and buttons all in order. For the lining of the coat there was fine yellow taffeta, and for the buttonholes of the waistcoat there was cherry-colored twist. And everything was ready to sew together in the morning, all measured and sufficient, except that there was wanting just one single skein of cherry-colored twisted silk. The tailor came out of his shop at dark, for he did not sleep there at nights. He fastened the window and locked the door and took away the key. No one lived there at night but the little brown mice, and they run in and out without any keys. For behind the wooden wainscots of all the old houses in Gloucester there are little mouse staircases and secret trapdoors, and all the mice run from house to house through those long narrow passages. They can run all over town without going into the streets. But the tailor came out of his shop and shuffled home through the snow. He lived quite near by, in College Court, next the doorway to College Green, and although it was not a big house, the tailor was so poor he only rented the kitchen. He lived along with his cat. It was called Simpkin. Now all day long, while the tailor was at work, Simpkin kept house by himself, and he also was fond of the mice, though he gave them no satins for coats. "Meow," said the cat when the tailor opened the door. "Meow." The tailor replied, "Simpkin, we shall make our fortune, but I am worn to a ravelling. Take this groat, which is our last 4pence, and Simpkin, take a china pipkin, buy a penn'orth of bread, a penn'orth of milk, and a penn'orth of sausages. And oh, Simpkin, with the last penny of our 4pence, buy me 1 penn'orth of cherry-coloured silk. But do not lose the last penny of the 4pence, Simpkin, or I am undone and worn to a thread paper, for I have no more twist." Then Simpkin again said, "Meow," and took the groat and the pipkin, and went out into the dark. The tailor was very tired and beginning to be ill. He sat down by the hearth and talked to himself about that wonderful coat. "I shall make my fortune, to be cut bias. The mayor of Gloucester is to be married on Christmas Day in the morning, and he hath ordered a coat and an embroidered waistcoat, to be lined with yellow taffeta, and the taffeta sufficeth. There is no more left over in snippets than will serve to make tippets for mice." Then the tailor started, for suddenly, interrupting him, from the dresser at the other side of the kitchen came a number of little noises. Tip-tap, tip-tap, tip-tap-tip. "Now what can that be?" said the tailor of Gloucester, jumping up from his chair. The dresser was covered with crockery and pipkins, willow-patterned plates, and teacups and mugs. The tailor crossed the kitchen and stood quite still beside the dresser, listening and peering through his spectacles. Again from under a teacup came those funny little noises. Tip-tap, tip-tap, tip-tap-tip. "This is very peculiar," said the tailor of Gloucester, and he lifted up the teacup, which was upside down. Out stepped a little live lady mouse, and made a curtsy to the tailor. Then she hopped away down off the dresser and under the wainscot. The tailor sat down again by the fire, warming his poor cold hands and mumbling to himself. "The waistcoat is cut out from peach-coloured satin, tambour stitch and rosebuds and beautiful floss silk. Was I wise to entrust my last 4pence to Simpkin? 1 and 20 buttonholes of cherry-coloured twist." But all at once from the dresser there came other little noises. Tip-tap, tip-tap, tip-tap-tip. "This is passing extraordinary," said the Tailor of Gloucester, and turned over another teacup, which was upside down. Out stepped a little gentleman mouse and made a bow to the tailor, and then from all over the dresser came a chorus of little tappings, all sounding together and answering one another, like watch beetles in an old worm-eaten window shutter. Tip-tap, tip-tap, tip-tap-tip. And out from under teacups and from under bowls and basins stepped other and more little mice, who hopped away down off the dresser and under the wainscot. The tailor sat down close over the fire, lamenting, 21 buttonholes of cherry-coloured silk, to be finished by noon of Saturday, and this is Tuesday evening. Was it right to let loose those mice? Undoubtedly the property of Simpkin. Alack, I am undone, for I have no more twist. The little mice came out again and listened to the tailor. They took notice of the pattern on that wonderful coat. They whispered to one another about the taffeta lining, and about little mouse tippets. And then all at once they all ran away together down the passage behind the wainscot, squeaking and calling to one another, as they ran from house to house, and not one mouse was left in the tailor's kitchen when Simpkin came back with the pipkin of milk. Simpkin opened the door and bounced in with an angry "Grrrmeow," like a cat that is vexed, for he hated the snow, and there was snow in his ears and snow in his collar at the back of his neck. He put down the loaf and the sausages upon the dresser and sniffed. "Simpkin," said the tailor, "where is my twist?" But Simpkin set down the pipkin of milk upon the dresser and looked suspiciously at the teacups. He wanted his supper of little fat mouse. "Simpkin," said the tailor, "where is my twist?" But Simpkin hid a little parcel privately in the teapot, and spit and growled at the tailor, and if Simpkin had been able to talk, he would have asked, "Where's my mouse?" "Alack, I am undone," said the Tailor of Gloucester, and went sadly to bed. All that night long Simpkin hunted and searched through the kitchen, peeping into cupboards and under the wainscot, and into the teapot where he had hidden that twist, but still he found never a mouse. Whenever the tailor muttered and talked in his sleep, Simpkin said, "Meow, grush," and made strange horrid noises as cats do at night. For the poor old tailor was very ill with a fever, tossing and turning in his four-post bed, and still in his dreams he mumbled, "No more twist, no more twist." All that day he was ill, and the next day, and the next, and what should become of the cherry-coloured coat? In the tailor's shop in Westgate Street the embroidered silken satin lay cut out upon the table, 21 buttonholes, and who should come to sew them when the window was barred and the door was fast locked? But that does not hinder the little brown mice. They run in and out without any keys through all the old houses in Gloucester. Out of doors the market folks went trudging through the snow to buy their geese and turkeys, and to bake their Christmas pies. But there would be no Christmas dinner for Simpkin and the poor old Tailor of Gloucester. The tailor lay ill for 3 days and nights, and then it was Christmas Eve, and very late at night. The moon climbed up over the roofs and chimneys, and looked down over the gateway into College Court. There were no lights in the windows, nor any sound in the houses. All the city of Gloucester was fast asleep under the snow. And still Simpkin wanted his mice, and he mewed as he stood beside the four-post bed. But it is in the old story that all the beasts can talk in the night between Christmas Eve and Christmas Day in the morning, though there are very few folk that can hear them, or know what it is that they say. When the cathedral clock struck 12, there was an answer, like an echo of the chimes, and Simpkin heard it, and came out of the tailor's door, and wandered about in the snow. From all the roofs and gables and old wooden houses in Gloucester came 1,000 merry voices singing the old Christmas rhymes, all the songs that ever I heard of, and some that I don't know, like Whittington's bells. First and loudest the cocks cried out, "Dame, get up and bake your pies!" "Oh, dilly, dilly, dilly," sighed Simpkin. And now in a garret there were lights and sounds of dancing, and cats came from over the way. "Hey, diddle, diddle, the cat and the fiddle, all the cats in Gloucester except me," said Simpkin. Under the wooden eaves the starlings and sparrows sang of Christmas pies. The jackdaws woke in the cathedral tower, and although it was the middle of the night, the throstles and robins sang. The air was quite full of little twittering tunes. But it was all rather provoking to poor hungry Simpkin. Particularly he was vexed with some little shrill voices from behind a wooden lattice. I think that they were bats, because they always have very small voices, especially in a black frost when they talk in their sleep like the Tailor of Gloucester. They said something mysterious that sounded like, "Buzz," quoth the blue fly, "hum," quoth the bee, "buzz and hum," they cry, and so do we. And Simpkin went away shaking his ears as if he had a bee in his bonnet. From the tailor's shop in Westgate came a glow of light, and when Simpkin crept up to peep in at the window, it was full of candles. There was a snippeting of scissors and snappeting of thread, and little mouse voices sang loudly and gaily, 420 tailors went to catch a snail. The best man among them durst not touch a tail. She put out her horns like a little Kylo cow. Run, tailors, run, or she'll have you all e'en now. Then without a pause the little mouse voices went on again. Sieve my lady's oatmeal, grind my lady's flour, put it in a chest, not let it stand an hour. Meow, meow, interrupted Simpkin, and he scratched at the door. But the key was under the tailor's pillow, and he could not get in. The little mice only laughed and tried another tune. 3 little mice sat down to spin. Pussy passed by, and she peeped in. What are you at, my fine little men? Making coats for gentlemen. Shall I come in and cut off your threads? Oh no, Miss Pussy, you'd bite off our heads. Meow, meow, cried Simpkin. Hey, diddle dinkety, answered the little mice. Hey, diddle dinkety, poppety pet. The merchants of London, they wear scarlet, silk in the collar and gold in the hem. So merrily march the merchantmen. They clicked their thimbles to mark the time, but none of the songs pleased Simpkin. He sniffed and mewed at the door of the shop. And then I bought a pipkin and a popkin, a slipkin and a slopkin, all for 1 farthing. And upon the kitchen dresser, added the rude little mice. Mew, scratch, scratch, snuffled Simpkin on the window-sill, while the little mice inside sprang to their feet, and all began to shout at once in their little twittering voices, No more twist! No more twist! And they barred up the window shutters and shut out Simpkin. But still through the nicks in the shutters he could hear the click of thimbles and little mouse voices singing, No more twist! No more twist! Simpkin came away from the shop and went home, considering in his mind. He found the poor old tailor without fever, sleeping peacefully. Then Simpkin went on tiptoe and took a little parcel of silk out of the teapot and looked at it in the moonlight, and he felt quite ashamed of his badness compared with those good little mice. When the tailor awoke in the morning, the first thing which he saw upon the patchwork quilt was a skein of cherry-coloured twisted silk, and beside his bed stood the repentant Simpkin. Alack, I am worn to a ravelling, said the Tailor of Gloucester, but I have my twist. The sun was shining on the snow when the tailor got up and dressed, and came out into the street, with Simpkin running behind him. The starlings whistled on the chimney stacks, and the throstles and robins sang, but they sang their own little noises, not the words they had sung in the night. Alack, said the tailor, I have my twist, but no more strength nor time than will serve me to make 1 single buttonhole, for this is Christmas Day in the morning. The Mayor of Gloucester shall be married by noon, and where is his cherry-coloured coat? He unlocked the door of the little shop in Westgate Street, and Simpkin ran in, like a cat that expects something. But there was no one there, not even one little brown mouse. The boards were swept clean, the little ends of thread and the little silk snippets were all tidied away and gone from off the floor. But upon the table, oh joy, the tailor gave a shout. There, where he had left plain cuttings of silk, there lay the most beautifulest coat and embroidered satin waistcoat that ever were worn by a mayor of Gloucester. There were roses and pansies upon the facing of the coat, and the waistcoat was worked with poppies and cornflowers. Everything was finished except just 1 single cherry-coloured buttonhole, and where that buttonhole was wanting, there was pinned a scrap of paper with these words, in little teeny-weeny writing, No more twist. And from then began the luck of the Tailor of Gloucester. He grew quite stout, and he grew quite rich. He made the most wonderful waistcoats for all the rich merchants of Gloucester, and for all the fine gentlemen of the country round. Never were seen such ruffles or such embroidered cuffs and lappets, but his buttonholes were the greatest triumph of it all. The stitches of those buttonholes were so neat, I wonder how they could be stitched by an old man in spectacles, with crooked old fingers and a tailor's thimble. The stitches of those buttonholes were so small, they looked as if they had been made by little mice. End of The Tailor of Gloucester by Beatrix Potter. Read by Faith Ann Gibson.
The Tale of Johnny Town Mouse by Beatrix Potter. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Johnny Town Mouse was born in the cupboard. Timmy Willie was born in the garden. Timmy Willie was a little country mouse who went to town by mistake in a hamper. The gardener sent vegetables to town once a week by carrier. He packed them in a big hamper. The gardener left the hamper by the garden gate so that the carrier could pick it up when he passed. Timmy Willie crept in through a hole in the wicker work, and after eating some peas, Timmy Willie fell fast asleep. He woke in a fright while the hamper was being lifted into the carrier's cart. Then there was a jolting and the clattering of horses' feet. Other packages were thrown in for miles and miles, jolt, 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 and Timmy Willie trembled amongst the jumbled up vegetables. At last the cart stopped at a house, where the hamper was taken out, carried in, and set down. The cook gave the carrier 6 pence. The back door banged, and the cart rumbled away. But there was no quiet. There seemed to be hundreds of carts passing. Dogs barked. Boys whistled in the street. The cook laughed. The parlor maid ran up and down stairs, and the cannery sang like a steam engine. Timmy Willie, who had lived all his life in a garden, was almost frightened to death. Presently the cook opened the hamper and began to unpack the vegetables. Out sprang the terrified Timmy Willie. Up jumped the cook on a chair, exclaiming, "A mouse! A mouse! Call the cat! Fetch me the poker, Sarah!" Timmy Willie did not wait for Sarah with the poker. He rushed along the skirting board till he came to a little hole, and in he popped. He dropped half a foot and crashed into the middle of a mouse dinner party, breaking 3 glasses. "Who in the world is this?" inquired Johnny Town Mouse. But after the first exclamation of surprise, he instantly recovered his manners. With the utmost politeness, he introduced Timmy Willie to 9 other mice, all with long tails and white neckties. Timmy Willie's own tail was insignificant. Johnny Town Mouse and his friends noticed it, but they were too well bred to make personal remarks. Only one of them asked Timmy Willie if he had ever been in a trap. The dinner was of 8 courses, not much of anything, but truly elegant. All the dishes were unknown to Timmy Willie, who would have been a little afraid of tasting them. Only he was very hungry and very anxious to behave with company manners. The continual noise upstairs made him so nervous that he dropped a plate. "Never mind, they don't belong to us," said Johnny. "Why don't those youngsters come back with the dessert?" It should be explained that 2 young mice who were waiting on the others went skirmishing upstairs to the kitchen between courses. Several times they had come tumbling in, squeaking and laughing. Timmy Willie learned with horror that they were being chased by the cat. His appetite failed. He felt faint. "Try some jelly?" said Johnny Town Mouse. "No. Would you rather go to bed? I will show you a most comfortable sofa pillow." The sofa pillow had a hole in it. Johnny Town Mouse quite honestly recommended it as the best pillow kept exclusively for visitors. But the sofa smelt of cat. Timmy Willie preferred to spend a miserable night under the fender. It was just the same next day. An excellent breakfast was provided for mice accustomed to eat bacon, but Timmy Willie had been reared on roots and salad. Johnny Town Mouse and his friends racketed about under the floors, and came boldly out all over the house in the evening. One particularly loud crash had been caused by Sarah tumbling downstairs with the tea tray. There were crumbs and sugar and smears of jam to be collected in spite of the cat. Timmy Willie longed to be at home in his peaceful nest in a sunny bank. The food disagreed with him. The noise prevented him from sleeping. In a few days he grew so thin that Johnny Town Mouse noticed it and questioned him. He listened to Timmy Willie's story and inquired about the garden. "It sounds rather a dull place. What do you do when it rains?" When it rains, I sit in my little sandy burrow and shell corn and seeds from my autumn store. I peep out at throstles and blackbirds on the lawn, and my friend Cock Robin, and when the sun comes out again, you should see my garden and the flowers. Roses and pinks and pansies, no noise except the birds and bees, and the lambs in the meadows. "There goes that cat again!" exclaimed Johnny Town Mouse, when they had taken refuge in the coal cellar. He resumed the conversation. "I confess I am a little disappointed. We have endeavored to entertain you, Timothy William." "Oh, yes, yes, you have been most kind, but I do feel so ill," said Timmy Willie. "It may be that your teeth and digestion are unaccustomed to our food. Perhaps it might be wiser for you to return in the hamper." "Oh, oh!" cried Timmy Willie. "Why, of course, for the matter of that, we could have sent you back last week," said Johnny rather huffily. "Did you not know that the hamper goes back empty on Saturdays?" So Timmy Willie said goodbye to his new friends and hid in the hamper with a crumb of cake and a withered cabbage leaf, and left much jolting, he was set down safely in his own garden. Sometimes on Saturdays he went to look at the hamper lying by the gate, but he knew better than to get in again, and nobody got out, though Johnny Town Mouse had half promised a visit. The winter passed, the sun came out again. Timmy Willie sat by his burrow, warming his little fur coat and sniffing the smell of violets and spring grass. He had nearly forgotten his visit to town, when up the sandy path, all spick and span with a brown leather bag, came Johnny Town Mouse. Timmy Willie received him with open arms. "You have come at the best of all the year. We will have herb pudding and sit in the sun." "It is a little damp," said Johnny Town Mouse, who was carrying his tail under his arm out of the mud. "What is that fearful noise?" he started violently. "That?" said Timmy Willie. "That is only a cow. I will beg a little milk. They are quite harmless, unless they happen to lie down upon you. How are all our friends?" Johnny's account was rather middling. He explained why he was paying his visit so early in the season. The family had gone to the seaside for Easter. The cook was doing spring cleaning, on board wages, with particular instructions to clear out the mice. There were 4 kittens, and the cat had killed the canary. "They say we did it, but I know better," said Johnny Town Mouse. "Whatever is that fearful racket?" "That is only the lawn-mower. I will fetch some of the grass clippings presently to make your bed. I'm sure you had better settle in the country, Johnny." We shall see by Tuesday week. The hampers stop while they are at the seaside." "I'm sure you will never want to live in town again," said Timmy Willie. But he did. He went back in the very next hamper of vegetables. He said it was too quiet. One place suits one person, another place suits another person. For my part, I prefer to live in the country, like Timmy Willie. End of The Tale of Johnny Town Mouse by Beatrix Potter. The Tale of Tom Kitten by Beatrix Potter. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Once upon a time, there were 3 little kittens, and their names were Mittens, Tom Kitten, and Moppet. They had dear little fur coats of their own, and they tumbled about the doorstep and played in the dust. But one day their mother, Mrs. Tabitha Twitchit, expected friends to tea. So she fetched the kittens indoors to wash and dress them before the fine company arrived. First she scrubbed their faces. This one is Moppet. Then she brushed their fur. This one is Mittens. Then she combed their tails and whiskers. This is Tom Kitten. Tom was very naughty, and he scratched. Mrs. Tabitha dressed Moppet and Mittens in clean pinafores and tuckers, and then she took all sorts of elegant, uncomfortable clothes out of a chest of drawers, in order to dress up her son, Thomas. Tom Kitten was very fat, and he had grown. Several buttons burst off. His mother sewed them on again. When the 3 kittens were ready, Mrs. Tabitha unwisely turned them out into the garden to be out the way while she made hot buttered toast. "Now keep your frocks clean, children. You must walk on your hind legs. Keep away from the dirty ash pit, and from Sally Henny Penny, and from the pig-sty and the puddle ducks. Moppet and Mittens walked down the garden path unsteadily. Presently they trod upon their pinafores and fell on their noses. When they stood up, there were several green smears. "Let us climb up the rockery and sit on the garden wall," said Moppet. They turned their pinafores back to front and went up with a skip and a jump. Moppet's white tucker fell down into the road. Tom Kitten was quite unable to jump when walking upon his hind legs and trousers. He came up the rockery by degrees, breaking the ferns and shedding buttons right and left. He was all in pieces when he reached the top of the wall. Moppet and Mittens tried to pull him together. His hat fell off and the rest of his buttons burst. While they were in difficulties, there was a pit-pat, paddle-pat, and the 3 puddle ducks came along the hard high road, marching one behind the other and doing the goose step. Pit-pat, paddle-pat, pit-pat, waddle-pat. They stopped and stood in a row and stared up at the kittens. They had very small eyes and looked surprised. Then the 2 duck-birds, Rebecca and Jemima, Puddle Duck picked up the hat and tucker and put them on. Mittens laughed so that she fell off the wall. Moppet and Tom descended after her. The pinafores and all the rest of Tom's clothes came off on the way down. "Come, Mr. Drake Puddle Duck," said Moppet. "Come and help us to dress him. Come and button up Tom." Mr. Drake Puddle Duck advanced in a slow sideways manner and picked up the various articles, but he put them on himself. They fitted him even worse than Tom Kitten. "It's a very fine morning," said Mr. Drake Puddle Duck, and he and Jemima and Rebecca Puddle Duck set off up the road, keeping step. Pit-pat, paddle-pat, pit-pat, waddle-pat. Then Tabitha Twitchit came down the garden and found her kittens on the wall with no clothes on. She pulled them off the wall, smacked them, and took them back to the house. "My friends will arrive in a minute, and you are not fit to be seen. I am affronted," said Mrs. Tabitha Twitchit. She sent them upstairs, and I am sorry to say she told her friends that they were in bed with the measles, which was not true. Quite the contrary. They were not in bed, not in the least. Somehow there were very extraordinary noises overhead, which disturbed the dignity and repose of the tea party. And I think that some day I shall have to make another, larger book to tell you more about Tom Kitten. As for the puddle ducks, they went into a pond. The clothes all came off directly because there were no buttons. And Mr. Drake Puddle Duck and Jemima and Rebecca have been looking for them ever since. End of The Tale of Tom Kitten by Beatrix Potter.
The Capture of Father Time by L. Frank Baum. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Jim was the son of a cowboy and lived on the broad plains of Arizona. His father had trained him to lasso a bronco or a young bull with perfect accuracy, and had Jim possessed the strength to back up his skill, he would have been as good a cowboy as any in all Arizona. When he was 12 years old, he made his first visit to the East, where Uncle Charles, his father's brother, lived. Of course, Jim took his lasso with him, for he was proud of his skill in casting it, and wanted to show his cousins what a cowboy could do. At first, the city boys and girls were much interested in watching Jim lasso posts and fence pickets, but they soon tired of it, and even Jim decided it was not the right sort of sport for cities. But one day the butcher asked Jim to ride one of his horses into the country, to a pasture that had been engaged, and Jim eagerly consented. He had been longing for a horseback ride, and to make it seem like old times, he took his lasso with him. He rode through the streets demurely enough, but on reaching the open country roads, his spirits broke forth into wild jubilation, and urging the butcher's horse to full gallop, he dashed away in true cowboy fashion. Then he wanted still more liberty, and letting down the bars that led into a big field, he began riding over the meadow and throwing his lasso at imaginary cattle, while he yelled and whooped to his heart's content. Suddenly, on making a long cast with his lasso, the loop caught upon something and rested about 3 feet from the ground, while the rope drew taut and nearly pulled Jim from his horse. This was unexpected. More than that, it was wonderful, for the field seemed bare of even a stump. Jim's eyes grew big with amazement, but he knew he had caught something when a voice cried out, "Here, let go! Let go, I say! Can't you see what you've done?" No, Jim couldn't see. nor did he intend to let go until he found out what was holding the loop of the lasso. So he resorted to an old trick his father had taught him, and, putting the butcher's horse to a run, began riding in a circle around the spot where his lasso had caught. And as he thus drew nearer and nearer his quarry, he saw the rope coil up, yet it looked to be coiling over nothing but air. One end of the lasso was made fast to a ring in the saddle, and when the rope was almost wound up and the horse began to pull away and snort with fear, Jim dismounted. Holding the reins of the bridle in one hand, he followed the rope, and an instant later saw an old man caught fast in the coils of the lasso. His head was bald and uncovered, but long white whiskers grew down to his waist. About his body was thrown a loose robe of fine white linen. In one hand he bore a great scythe, and beneath the other arm he carried an hourglass. While Jim gazed wonderingly upon him, this venerable old man spoke in an angry voice. "Now then, get that rope off as fast as you can. You've brought everything on earth to a standstill by your foolishness. Well, what are you staring at? Don't you know who I am?" "No," said Jim stupidly. "Well, I'm Time. Father Time. Now make haste and set me free, if you want the world to run properly." "How did I happen to catch you?" asked Jim, without making a move to release his captive. "I don't know. I've never been caught before," growled Father Time. "But I suppose it was because you were foolishly throwing your lasso at nothing."
"I didn't see you," said Jim.
"Of course you didn't. I'm invisible to the eyes of human beings unless they get within 3 feet of me, and I take care to keep more than that distance away from them. That's why I was crossing this field where I supposed no one would be. And I should have been perfectly safe had it not been for your beastly lasso. Now then," he added crossly, "are you going to get that rope off?" "Why should I?" asked Jim. "Because everything in the world stopped moving the moment you caught me. I don't suppose you want to make an end of all this business and pleasure, and war and love, and misery and ambition, and everything else, do you? Not a watch has ticked since you tied me up here like a mummy." Jim laughed. It really was funny to see the old man round and round with coils of rope from his knees up to his chin. "It'll do you good to rest," said the boy. "From all I've heard, you lead a rather busy life." "Indeed I do," replied Father Time with a sigh. "I'm due in Kamchatka this very minute, and to think one small boy is upsetting all my regular habits." "Too bad," said Jim with a grin. "But since the world has stopped anyhow, it won't matter if it takes a little longer recess. As soon as I let you go, time will fly again. Where are your wings?" "I haven't any," answered the old man. "That is a story cooked up by someone who never saw me. As a matter of fact, I move rather slowly." "I see. You take your time," remarked the boy. "What do you use that scythe for?" "To mow down the people," said the ancient one. "Every time I swing my scythe, someone dies." "Then I ought to win a life-saving medal by keeping you tied up," said Jim. "Some folks will live this much longer." "But they won't know it," said Father Time with a sad smile. "So it will do them no good. You may as well untie me at once." "No," said Jim with a determined air. "I may never capture you again, so I'll hold on to you for a while and see how the world wags without you." Then he swung the old man, bound as he was, upon the back of the butcher's horse, and getting into the saddle himself, started back towards town, one hand holding his prisoner and the other guiding the reins. When he reached the road, his eyes fell on a strange tableau. A horse and buggy stood in the middle of the road, the horse in the act of trotting with his head held high and his 2 legs in the air, but perfectly motionless. In the buggy a man and woman were seated, but had they been turned into stone they could not have been more still and stiff. "There's no time for them," sighed the old man. "Won't you let me go now?" "Not yet," replied the boy. He rode on until he reached the city, where all the people stood in exactly the same positions they were in when Jim lassoed Father Time. Stopping in front of a big dry goods store, the boy hitched his horse and went in. The clerks were measuring out goods and showing patterns to the rows of customers in front of them, but everyone seemed to have suddenly become a statue. There was something very unpleasant in this scene, and a cold shiver began to run up and down Jim's back, so he hurried out again. On the edge of the sidewalk sat a poor crippled beggar holding out his hat, and beside him stood a prosperous-looking gentleman who was about to drop a penny into the beggar's hat. Jim knew this gentleman to be very rich but rather stingy, so he ventured to run his hand into the man's pocket and take out his purse, in which was a $20 gold piece. This glittering coin he put in the gentleman's fingers instead of the penny, and then restored the purse to the rich man's pocket. That donation will surprise him when he comes to life, thought the boy. He mounted the horse again and rode up the street. As he passed the shop of his friend, the butcher, he noticed several pieces of meat hanging outside. "I'm afraid that meat'll spoil," he remarked. "It takes time to spoil meat," answered the old man. This struck Jim as being queer, but true. "It seems time meddles with everything," said he. "Yes, you've made a prisoner of the most important personage in the world," groaned the old man, "and you haven't enough sense to let him go again." Jim did not reply, and soon they came to his uncle's house, where he again dismounted. The street was filled with teams and people, but all were motionless. His two little cousins were just coming out of the gate on their way to school with their books and slates underneath their arms, so Jim had to jump over the fence to avoid knocking them down. In the front room sat his aunt reading her Bible. She was just turning a page when time stopped. In the dining room was his uncle, finishing his luncheon. His mouth was open and his fork poised just before it, while his eyes were fixed upon the newspaper folded beside him. Jim helped himself to his uncle's pie, and while he ate it, he walked out to his prisoner. "There's one thing I don't understand," said he. "What's that?" asked Father Time. "Why is it that I'm able to move around while everyone else is froze up?" "That is because I'm your prisoner," answered the other. "You can do anything you wish with time now, but unless you are careful, you'll do something you will be sorry for." Jim threw the crust of his pie at a bird that was suspended in the air where it had been flying when time stopped. "Anyway," he laughed, "I'm living longer than anyone else. No one will ever be able to catch up with me again." "Each life has its allotted span," said the old man. "When you have lived your proper time, my scythe will mow you down." "I forgot your scythe," said Jim thoughtfully. Then a spirit of mischief came into the boy's head, for he happened to think that the present opportunity to have fun would never occur again. He tied Father Time to his uncle's hitching post that he might not escape, and then crossed the road to the corner grocery. The grocer had scolded Jim that very morning for stepping into a basket of turnips by accident, so the boy went back to the end of the grocery and turned on the faucet of the molasses barrel. "That'll make a nice mess when time starts the molasses running all over the floor," said Jim with a laugh. A little further down the street was a barber shop, and sitting in the barber's chair, Jim saw the man that all the boys declared was the meanest man in town. He certainly did not like the boys, and the boys knew it. The barber was in the act of shampooing this person when time was captured. Jim ran to the drugstore, and getting a bottle of mucilage, he returned and poured it over the ruffled hair of the unpopular citizen. "That'll probably surprise him when he wakes up," thought Jim. Nearby was the schoolhouse. Jim entered it and found that only a few of the pupils were assembled, but the teacher sat at his desk, stern and frowning as usual. Taking a piece of chalk, Jim marked upon the blackboard in big letters the following words: "Every scholar is requested to yell the minute he enters the room. He will also please throw his books at the teacher's head. Signed, Professor Sharp." "That ought to raise a nice rumpus," murmured the mischief maker as he walked away. On the corner stood Policeman Mulligan, talking with old Miss Scrapple, the worst gossip in town, who always delighted in saying something disagreeable about her neighbors. Jim thought this opportunity was too good to lose, so he took off the policeman's cap and brass-buttoned coat and put them on Miss Scrapple, while the lady's feathered and ribboned hat he placed jauntily upon the policeman's head. The effect was so comical that the boy laughed out loud, and as a good many people were standing near the corner, Jim decided that Miss Scrapple and Officer Mulligan would create a sensation when time started upon his travels. Then the young cowboy remembered his prisoner, and walking back to the hitching post, he came within 3 feet of it and saw Father Time still standing patiently within the toils of the lasso. He looked angry and annoyed, however, and growled out, "Well, when do you intend to release me?" "I've been thinking about that ugly scythe of yours," said Jim. "What about it?" asked Father Time. "Perhaps if I let you go, you'll swing it at me the first thing to be revenged," replied the boy. Father Time gave him a severe look, but said, "I've known boys for thousands of years, and of course I know they're mischievous and reckless. But I like boys because they grow up to be men and people my world. Now, if a man had caught me by accident, as you did, I could have scared him into letting me go instantly, but boys are harder to scare. I don't know as I blame you. I was a boy myself long ago when the world was new. But surely you've had enough fun with me by this time, and now I hope you'll show the respect that is due to old age. Let me go, and in return I will promise to forget all about my capture. The incident won't do much harm anyway, for no one will ever know that time has halted the last 3 hours or so." "All right," said Jim cheerfully. "Since you've promised not to mow me down, I'll let you go." But he had a notion some people in the town would suspect time had stopped when they returned to life. He carefully unwound the rope from the old man, who, when he was free, at once shouldered his scythe, rearranged his white robe, and nodded farewell. Loud screams came from the corner, where a great crowd of people quickly assembled. From his seat on the horse, Jim saw Miss Scrapple, attired in the policeman's uniform, angrily shaking her fist in Mulligan's face, while the officer was furiously stamping upon the lady's hat, which he had torn from his own head amidst the jeers of the crowd. As he rode past the schoolhouse, he heard a tremendous chorus of yells, and knew Professor Sharp was having a hard time to quell the riot caused by the sign on the blackboard. Through the window of the barber shop, he saw the mean man frantically belaboring the barber with a hairbrush, while his hair stood up stiff as bayonets in all directions, and the grocer ran out of his door and yelled, "Fire!" while his shoes left a track of molasses wherever he stepped. Jim's heart was filled with joy. He was fairly reveling in the excitement he had caused when someone caught his leg and pulled him from the horse. "What are you doing here, you rascal?" cried the butcher angrily. "Didn't you promise to put that beast into Primplin's pasture? And now I find you riding the poor nag around like a gentleman of leisure." "That's a fact," said Jim with surprise. "I clean forgot about the horse." This story should teach us the supreme importance of time and the folly of trying to stop it. For should you succeed, as Jim did, in bringing time to a standstill, the world would soon become a dreary place and life decidedly unpleasant. End of The Capture of Father Time by L. Frank Baum. Read by Heather Eney.
Tale of Peter Rabbit by Beatrix Potter. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit Librivox.org. Once upon a time, there were 4 little rabbits, and their names were Flopsy, Mopsy, Cottontail, and Peter. They lived with their mother in a sandbank underneath the roots of a very big tree. "Now, my dears," said old Miss Rabbit one morning, "you may go into the fields or down the lane, but don't go into Mr. McGregor's garden. Your father had an accident there. He was put in a pie by Mrs. McGregor. Now run along and don't get into mischief. I'm going out." Then old Miss Rabbit took a basket and her umbrella, and went through the wood to the baker's. She bought a loaf of brown bread and 5 currant buns. Flopsy, Mopsy, and Cottontail, who were good little bunnies, went down the lane to gather blackberries. But Peter, who was very naughty, ran straight away to Mr. McGregor's garden and squeezed under the gate. First he ate some lettuce and some French beans, and then he ate some radishes, and then, feeling rather sick, he went to look for some parsley. But round the end of a cucumber frayed, whom should he meet but Mr. McGregor. Mr. McGregor was on his hands and knees planting out young cabbages, but he jumped up and ran after Peter, waving a rake and calling out, "Stop, thief!" Peter was most dreadfully frightened. He rushed all over the garden, for he had forgotten the way back to the gate. He lost one of his shoes among the cabbages and the other shoe amongst the potatoes. After losing them, he ran on 4 legs and went faster, so that I think he might have got away altogether if he had not unfortunately run into a gooseberry net and got caught by the large buttons on his jacket. It was a blue jacket with brass buttons, quite new. Peter gave himself up for lost and shed big tears, but his sobs were overheard by some friendly sparrows, who flew to him in great excitement and implored him to exert himself. Mr. McGregor came up with a seed, which he intended to pop upon the top of Peter, but Peter wriggled out just in time, leaving his jacket behind him, and rushed into the tool shed and jumped into a can. It would have been a beautiful thing to hide in, if it had not had so much water in it. Mr. McGregor was quite sure that Peter was somewhere in the tool shed, perhaps hidden underneath the flower pot. He began to turn them over carefully, looking under each. Presently, Peter sneezed. "Kerchoo!" Mr. McGregor was after him in no time, and tried to put his foot upon Peter, who jumped out of a window, upsetting 3 plants. The window was too small for Mr. McGregor, and he was tired of running after Peter. He went back to his work. Peter sat down to rest. He was out of breath and trembling with fright, and he had not the idea which way to go. Also, he was very damp with sitting in that can. After a time, he had begun to wander about, going lippity-lippity, not very fast, and looking all around. He found a door in the wall, but it was locked, and there was no room for a fat little rabbit to squeeze underneath. An old mouse was running in and out over the stone doorstep, carrying peas and beans to her family in the wood. Peter asked her the way to the gate, but she had so much a large pea in her mouth that she could not answer. She only shook her head at him. Peter began to cry. Then he tried to find his way straight across the garden, but he became more and more puzzled. Presently, he came to a pond where Mr. McGregor filled his water cans. A white cat was staring at some goldfish. She sat very, very still, but now and then the tip of her tail twitched as if it were alive. Peter thought it had best to go away without speaking to her. He had heard about cats from his cousin, little Benjamin Bunny. He went back towards the tool shed, but suddenly, quite close to him, he heard the noise of a hoe. Scritch, scritch, scratch, scratch, scritch. Peter scuttered underneath the bushes, but presently, as nothing happened, he came out and climbed upon a wheelbarrow and peeped over. The first thing he saw was Mr. McGregor hoeing onions. His back was turned towards Peter, and beyond him was the gate. Peter got down very quietly off the wheelbarrow and started running as fast as he could go along a straight walk behind some black currant bushes. Mr. McGregor caught sight of him at the corner, but Peter did not care. He slipped underneath the gate and was safe at last in the wood outside the garden. Mr. McGregor hung up the little jacket and the shoes for a scarecrow to frighten the black birds. Peter never stopped running or looked behind him till he got home to the big fir tree. He was so tired that he flopped down upon the nice soft sand on the floor of the rabbit hole and shut his eyes. His mother was busy cooking. She wondered what he had done with his clothes. It was the second little jacket and pair of shoes that Peter had lost in a fortnight. I am sorry to say that Peter was not very well during the evening. His mother put him to bed and made some Camlin tea, and she gave him a dose of it to Peter. 1 tablespoonful to be taken at bedtime. But Flopsy, Mopsy, and Cottontail had bread and milk and blackberries for supper. The end. End of The Tale of Peter Rabbit by Beatrix Potter.
The Velveteen Rabbit by Margery Williams. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. There was once a Velveteen Rabbit, and in the beginning he was really splendid. He was fat and bunchy, as a rabbit should be. His coat was spotted brown and white. He had real thread whiskers, and his ears were lined with pink sateen. On Christmas morning, when he sat wedged in the top of the boy's stocking with a sprig of holly between his paws, the effect was charming. There were other things in the stocking: nuts and oranges and a toy engine and chocolate almonds and a clockwork mouse, but the rabbit was quite the best of all. For at least 2 hours the boy loved him, and then the aunts and uncles came to dinner, and there was a great rustling of tissue paper and unwrapping of parcels, and in the excitement of looking at all the new presents, the Velveteen Rabbit was forgotten. For a long time he lived in the toy cupboard or on the nursery floor, and no one thought very much about him. He was naturally shy, and being only made of velveteen, some of the more expensive toys quite snubbed him. The mechanical toys were very superior, and looked down upon everyone else. They were full of modern ideas, and pretended they were real. The model boat, who had lived through 2 seasons and lost most of his paint, caught the tone from them, and never missed an opportunity of referring to his rigging in technical terms. The rabbit could not claim to be a model of anything, for he did not know that real rabbits existed. He thought they were all stuffed with sawdust like himself, and he understood that sawdust was quite out of date and should never be mentioned in modern circles. Even Timothy, the jointed wooden lion, who was made by the disabled soldiers and should have had broader views, put on airs and pretended he was connected with government. Between them all, the poor little rabbit was made to feel himself very insignificant and commonplace, and the only person who was kind to him at all was the Skin Horse. The Skin Horse had lived longer in the nursery than any of the others. He was so old that his brown coat was bald in patches and showed the seams underneath, and most of the hairs in his tail had been pulled out to string bead necklaces. He was wise, for he had seen a long succession of mechanical toys arrive to boast and swagger, and by break their mainsprings and pass away, and he knew that they were only toys and would never turn into anything else. For nursery magic is very strange and wonderful, and only those playthings that are old and wise and experienced like the Skin Horse understand all about it. "What is real?" asked the rabbit one day, when they were lying side by side near the nursery fender before Nana came to tidy the room. "Does it mean having things that buzz inside you and a stick-out handle?" "Real isn't how you are made," said the Skin Horse. "It's just a thing that happens to you. When a child loves you for a long, long time, not just to play with, but really loves you, then you become real." "Does it hurt?" asked the rabbit. "Sometimes," said the Skin Horse, for he was always truthful. "When you are real, you don't mind being hurt." "Does it happen all at once, like being wound up?" he asked. "It doesn't happen all at once," said the Skin Horse. "You become. It takes a long time. That's why it doesn't happen often to people who break easily, or have sharp edges, or have to be carefully kept. Generally, by the time you are real, most of your hair has been loved off, and your eyes drop out and you get loose in the joints and very shabby. But these things don't matter at all, because once you are real, You can't be ugly, except to people who don't understand." "I suppose you are real?" said the rabbit. And then he wished he had not said it, for he thought the Skin Horse might be sensitive. But the Skin Horse only smiled. "The boy's uncle made me real," he said. "That was a great many years ago. But once you are real, you can't become unreal again. It lasts for always." He thought it would be a long time before this magic called real happened to him. He longed to become real, to know what it felt like. And yet the idea of growing shabby and losing his eyes and whiskers was rather sad. He wished that he could become it, without these uncomfortable things happening to him. There was a person called Nana who ruled the nursery. Sometimes she took no notice of the playthings lying about, and sometimes, for no reason whatever, she went swooping about like a great wind and hustled them away in cupboards. She called this tidying up, and the playthings all hated it, especially the tin ones. The rabbit didn't mind it so much, for wherever he was thrown, he came down soft. One evening, when the boy was going to bed, he couldn't find the china dog that always slept with him. Nana was in a hurry, and it was too much trouble to hunt for china dogs at bedtime, so she simply looked around her, and seeing that the toy cupboard door stood open, she made a swoop. "Here," she said, "take your old bunny. He'll do to sleep with you." And she dragged the rabbit out by one ear, and put him into the boy's arms. That night, and for many nights after, the Velveteen rabbit slept in the boy's bed. At first he found it rather uncomfortable, for the boy hugged him very tight, and sometimes he rolled over on him, and sometimes he pushed him so far under the pillow that the rabbit could scarcely breathe. And he missed, too, those long moonlight hours in the nursery, when all the house was silent, and his talks with the Skin Horse. But very soon he grew to like it, for the boy used to talk to him, and made nice tunnels for him under the bedclothes that he said were like the burrows the real rabbits lived in. And they had splendid games together, in whispers, when Nana had gone away to her supper and left the nightlight burning on the mantelpiece. And so time went on, and the little rabbit was very happy. So happy that he never noticed how his beautiful velveteen fur was getting shabbier and shabbier, and his tail becoming unsewn, and all the pink rubbed off his nose where the boy had kissed him. Spring came, and they had long days in the garden, for wherever the boy went, the rabbit went too. He had rides in the wheelbarrow, and picnics on the grass, and lovely fairy huts built for him under the raspberry canes behind the flower border. And once, where the boy was called away suddenly to go out to tea, the rabbit was left out on the lawn until long after dusk, and Nana had to come and look for him with the candle, because the boy couldn't go to sleep unless he was there. "You must have your old bunny," she said. "Fancy all that fuss for a toy." The boy sat up in bed and stretched out his hands. "Give me my bunny," he said. "You mustn't say that. He isn't a toy, he's real." When the little rabbit heard that, he was happy, for he knew that what the Skin Horse had said was true at last. The nursery magic had happened to him, and he was a toy no longer. He was real. The boy himself had said it. That night he was almost too happy to sleep, and so much love stirred in his little sawdust heart that it almost burst, and into his boot-button eyes, that had long ago lost their polish, there came a look of wisdom and beauty, so that even Nana noticed it next morning when she picked him up and said, "I declare if that old bunny hasn't got quite a knowing expression." That was a wonderful summer. Near the house where they lived there was a wood, and in the long June evenings the boy liked to go there after tea to play. He took the Velveteen Rabbit with him, and before he wandered off to pick flowers or play at brigands among the trees, he always made the rabbit a little nest somewhere among the bracken, where he would be quite cozy, for he was a kind-hearted little boy, and he liked Bunny to be comfortable. One evening, while the rabbit was lying there alone, watching the ants that ran to and fro between his velvet paws in the grass, he saw two strange beings creep out of the tall bracken near him. They were rabbits like himself, but quite furry and brand new. They must have been very well made, for their seams didn't show at all, and they changed shape in a queer way when they moved. One minute they were long and thin, and the next minute fat and bunchy, instead of always staying the same like he did. Their feet patted softly on the ground, and they crept quite close to him, twitching their noses, while the rabbit stared hard to see which side the clockwork struck out, for he knew that people who jump generally have something to wind them up. But he couldn't see it. They were evidently a new kind of rabbit altogether. They stared at him, and the little rabbit stared back, and all the time their noses twitched. "Why don't you get up and play with us?" one of them asked. "I don't feel like it," said the rabbit, for he didn't want to explain that he had no clockwork. "Ho!" said the furry rabbit. "It's as easy as anything." And he gave a big hop sideways and stood on his hind legs. "I don't believe you can," he said. "I can," said the little rabbit. "I can jump higher than anything." He meant when the boy threw him, but of course he didn't want to say so. "Can you hop on your hind legs?" asked the furry rabbit. That was a dreadful question, for the Velveteen Rabbit had no hind legs at all. The back of him was made all in one piece, like a pincushion. He sat still in the bracken, and hoped that the other rabbits wouldn't notice. "I don't want to," he said again. But the wild rabbits have very sharp eyes, and this one stretched out his neck and looked. "He hasn't got any hind legs," he called out. "Fancy a rabbit without any hind legs." And he began to laugh. "I have," cried the little rabbit. "I have got hind legs. I am sitting on them." "Then stretch them out and show me like this," said the wild rabbit. And he began to whirl round and dance, till the little rabbit got quite dizzy. "I don't like dancing," he said. "I'd rather sit still." But all the while he was longing to dance, for a funny new tickly feeling ran through him, and he felt he would give anything in the world to be able to jump around like these rabbits did. The strange rabbit stopped dancing and came quite close. He came so close this time that his long whiskers brushed the Velveteen Rabbit's ear, and then he wrinkled his nose suddenly and flattened his ears and jumped backwards. "He doesn't smell right," he exclaimed. "He isn't a rabbit at all. He isn't real." "I am real," said the little rabbit. "I am real. The boy said so." And he nearly began to cry. Just then there was a sound of footsteps, and the boy ran past near them, and with a stamp of feet and a flash of white tails, the two strange rabbits disappeared. "Come back and play with me," called the little rabbit. "Oh, do come back. I know I am real." But there was no answer. Only the little ants ran to and fro, and the bracken swayed gently where the two strangers had passed. The Velveteen Rabbit was all alone. "Oh dear," he thought. "Why did they run away like that? Why couldn't they stop and talk to me?" For a long time he lay very still, watching the bracken, and hoping that they would come back. But they never returned, and presently the sun sank lower and the little white moths fluttered out, and the boy came and carried him home. Weeks passed, and the little rabbit grew very old and shabby, but the boy loved him just as much. He loved him so hard that he loved all his whiskers off, and the pink lining to his ears turned gray, and his brown spots faded. He even began to lose his shape, and he scarcely looked like a rabbit anymore, except to the boy. To him, he was always beautiful, and that was all that the little rabbit cared about. He didn't mind how he looked to other people, because the nursery magic had made him real. And when you are real, shabbiness doesn't matter. And then, one day, the boy was ill. His face grew very flushed, and he talked in his sleep, and his little body was so hot that it burned the rabbit when he held him close. Strange people came and went in the nursery, and a light burned all night, and through it all the little Velveteen rabbit lay there, hidden from sight under the bedclothes, and he never stirred, for he was afraid that if they found him, someone might take him away, and he knew that the boy needed him. It was a long, weary time, for the boy was too ill to play, and the little rabbit found it rather dull with nothing to do all day long. But he snuggled down patiently, and looked forward to the time when the boy should be well again, and they would go out in the garden, amongst the flowers and the butterflies, and play splendid games in the raspberry thicket like they used to. All sorts of delightful things he planned, and while the boy lay half asleep, he crept up close to the pillow and whispered them in his ear. And presently the fever turned, and the boy got better. He was able to sit up in bed and look at picture books, while the little rabbit cuddled close at his side. And one day they let him get up and dress. It was a bright, sunny morning, and the windows stood wide open. They had carried the boy out onto the balcony, wrapped in a shawl, and the little rabbit lay tangled up among the bedclothes, thinking. The boy was going to the seaside tomorrow. Everything was arranged, and now it only remained to carry out the doctor's orders. They had talked about it all, while the little rabbit lay under the bedclothes with just his head peeping out, and listened. The room was to be disinfected, and all the books and toys that the boy had played with in bed must be burnt. "Hurrah!" thought the little rabbit. "Tomorrow we shall go to the seaside!" For the boy had often talked of the seaside, and he wanted very much to see the big waves coming in, and the tiny crabs, and the sand castles. Just then, Nana caught sight of him. "How about his old bunny?" she asked. "That?" said the doctor. "Why, it's a mass of scarlet fever germs. Burn it at once." "What? Nonsense! Get him a new one. He mustn't have that any more." And so the little rabbit was put into a sack with the old picture books and a lot of rubbish, and carried out to the end of the garden behind the fowl house. That was a fine place to make a bonfire, only the gardener was too busy just then to attend it. He had the potatoes to dig, and the green peas to gather, but next morning he promised to come quite early and burn the whole lot. That night, the boy slept in a different room, and he had a new bunny to sleep with him. It was a splendid bunny, all white plush with real glass eyes, but the boy was too excited to care very much about it, for tomorrow he was going to the seaside, and that in itself was such a wonderful thing that he could think of nothing else. And while the boy was asleep, dreaming of the seaside, the little rabbit lay among the old picture books in the corner behind the fowl house, and he felt very lonely. The sack had been left untied, and so, by wriggling a bit, he was able to get his head through the opening and look out. He was shivering a little, for he had always been used to sleeping in a proper bed, and by this time his coat had worn so thin and threadbare from hugging that it was no longer any protection to him. Nearby he could see the thicket of raspberry canes, growing tall and close like a tropical jungle, in whose shadow he had played with the boy on bygone mornings. He thought of those long sunlit hours in the garden. How happy they were! And a great sadness came over him. He seemed to see them all pass before him, each more beautiful than the other. The fairy huts in the flower bed, the quiet evenings in the wood where he lay in the bracken and the little ants ran over his paws. The wonderful day when he first knew that he was real. He thought of the skin horse, so wise and gentle, and all that he had told him. Of what use was it to be loved and lose one's beauty and become real if it all ended like this? And then a strange thing happened. For where the tear had fallen, a flower grew out of the ground. A mysterious flower, not at all like any that grew in the garden. It had slender green leaves the color of emeralds, and in the center of the leaves a blossom like a golden cup. It was so beautiful that the little rabbit forgot to cry, and just lay there watching it. And presently the blossom opened, and out of it there stepped a fairy. She was quite the loveliest fairy in the whole world. Her dress was of pearl and dewdrops, and there were flowers round her neck and in her hair, and her face was like the most perfect flower of all. And she came close to the little rabbit, and gathered him up in her arms, and kissed him on his velveteen nose that was all damp from crying. "Little rabbit," she said, "don't you know who I am?" The rabbit looked up at her, and it seemed to him that he had seen her face before, but he couldn't think where. "I am the nursery magic fairy," she said. "I take care of all the playthings that the children have loved. When they are old and worn out and the children don't need them any more, then I come and take them away with me and turn them into real." "Wasn't I real before?" asked the little rabbit. "You were real to the boy," the fairy said, "because he loved you. Now you shall be real to everyone." And she held the little rabbit close in her arms and flew with him into the wood. It was light now, for the moon had risen. All the forest was beautiful, and the fronds of the bracken shone like frosted silver. In the open glade between the tree trunks, the wild rabbits danced with their shadows on the velvet grass. But when they saw the fairy, they all stopped dancing and stood round in a ring to stare at her. "I've brought you a new playfellow," the fairy said. "You must be very kind to him, and teach him all he needs to know in Rabbitland, for he is going to live with you forever and ever." And she kissed the little rabbit again, and put him down on the grass. "Run and play, little rabbit," she said. But the little rabbit sat quite still for a moment and never moved. For when he saw all the wild rabbits dancing around him, he suddenly remembered about his hind legs, and he didn't want them to see that he was made all in one piece. He did not know that when the fairy kissed him that last time, she had changed him altogether, and he might have sat there a long time, too shy to move, if just then something hadn't tickled his nose, and before he thought what he was doing, he lifted his hind toe to scratch it. And he found that he actually had hind legs. Instead of dingy velveteen, he had brown fur, soft and shiny. His ears twitched by themselves, and his whiskers were so long that they brushed the grass. He gave one leap, and the joy of using those hind legs was so great that he went springing about the turf on them, jumping sideways and whirling round as the others did. And he grew so excited that when at last he did stop to look for the fairy, she was gone. He was a real rabbit at last, at home with the other rabbits. Autumn passed and winter. And in the spring, when the days grew warm and sunny, the boy went out to play in the wood behind his house. And while he was playing, 2 rabbits crept out from the bracken and peeped at him. One of them was brown all over, but the other had strange markings under his fur, as though long ago he had been spotted, and all the spots still showed through. And about his little soft nose and his round black eyes there was something familiar, so that the boy thought to himself, "Why, he looks just like my old bunny that I lost when I had scarlet fever." But he never knew that it really was his own bunny, come back to look at the child who had first helped him to be real. End of The Velveteen Rabbit by Margery Williams.
She Wished to Be a Princess by Fiske Davenport. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Little Mary had had a volume of Hans Andersen's fairy stories given her at Christmas. The story she liked best was The Princess and the Pea, for, like all little girls, little Mary had a natural desire to be a princess. When she went to bed at night with her doll, little Mary would think to herself,
"Oh, how beautiful to be a real princess of such fine blood as to feel a little bit of a pea under 20 mattresses."
One morning a comforting idea came to little Mary.
"Who knows," she said to herself, "with all my very many great-grandfathers and grandmothers, but perhaps I'm related to some king or queen way back."
Thereupon she went to her mother's pantry and took a bean from the jar, as large a one as she could find, and going to her room put it carefully under the hair mattress. That night she went to bed happy with joyful hopes. In the morning, little Mary's elder sister found her with her head buried in her pillow, crying.
"Oh,"
little Mary sobbed,
"I did think I might have just a little speck of royal blood in my veins. But I couldn't feel even that big bean under just one mattress."
Nothing would comfort little Mary until her mamma explained to her that even princesses were not happy unless they had good hearts. And she could have, if she tried, just as good and royal a heart as any princess under the sun. End of She Wished to Be a Princess by Fiske Davenport. Read by Heather Eney.